Good morning, everybody. Wait, could you... Louise? Thank you for your patience. As you may have seen, there's a lot of meetings going on in the Palais this week. It's the busiest week of the year, apparently, for meetings, which is a good sign for our organisation's health, I believe. So without more ado, we will open this conference on addressing violence and discrimination against LBQ women in Europe, which is around or focuses around the groundbreaking report by Beatrice Fresco-Rolfo. I'm Penelope. I'm head of the Secretariat of the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination of the Parliamentary Assembly, and we've organised this in cooperation with our friends and colleagues from the Intergovernmental SOGIESC Unit of the Steering Committee on Anti-Discrimination, and I can see represented here in the room. Thank you all for coming. Thank you also from the Parliamentary Assembly side of things to those parliamentarians who've made the journey today to come and join us. Let's start the meeting. I just would like to say one or two words about our three, what we call keynote speakers. I call them champions, three champions of these causes, questions, issues, the subjects on which the Equality Committee works. Despina Shatsi-Vassiliou-Sovidis is Secretary General of the Parliamentary Assembly. She's my boss, and she's not just a great boss, she's a great ally. She is always defending the place of our reports on the plenary session agendas, despite certain doubts and reservations of certain parliamentarians. So we can trust in her to defend all of the recommendations that our parliamentarians are making. She's also founder of a women's group in the Assembly, Women at Pace, and we also launched, I would say, together in the Parliamentary Assembly, the Vigdis Prize, which she will mention, I think. So thank you for being here with us, Despina. Michael O'Flaherty, we've known him for, well, dare I say, many years in the Fundamental Rights Agency, and now very close up in the Council of Europe as Commissioner for Human Rights. And of course, the Commissioner's role is extremely important for achieving progress in member states, of calling member states to challenging them and calling them to accountability with the independence of that position. So thank you also for coming, Michael, today. And then all these people that I've worked with for years. Lady Phil is a new champion, one of our three champions to open the session. UK Black Pride, fantastic to have your testimony, to have your experience, and to give us another dimension or further dimensions of the work that we can do and that our parliamentarians and indeed our governments and ministries can do as well. So thank you so much for being here today. And we have two great moderators, one of whom is already here to moderate the first session, Bella Fitzpatrick, and she is, we know her also in the Equality Committee, the Parliamentary Assembly, also impetus given not only by the Secretary General of the Assembly but also by the President to work more closely with youth representatives. So Bella is from the IGLIO umbrella youth organisation, and we also count on these youth representatives to bring us the new challenges and the new phenomena that are emerging in our society. So thank you very much for being here, Bella. And this afternoon, yes, we have we will have another, because moderators are here to introduce the speakers, but nobody introduces the moderators. So Irene Seilinger, an organisation, well, she's not an organisation herself, but she comes from WAVE, founder of Garance, and she is, well, WAVE is also an organism with which we work very, very closely on particular subjects and specific things. That's it from me. Thank you very much for being here once again, and it's a pleasure and an honour to give the floor to Despina Shatsi-Vassiliou-Sovidis.
Thank you very much, Penelope. A long name for a small person, so normally they just call me Despina. It's easier. Dear Assembly members, Excellencies, Commissioner, special guest, and distinguished guests and colleagues, it is really an honor for me to open this conference today. And as I was saying to some of you, I had to be in two different places, as it often happens. But for once, I thought what really interests me is happening here in Strasbourg. So for once, I stayed home to be part of something really special. It is a great honor because I see together in the same room so many parliamentarians, experts, activists on this issue dedicated to addressing violence and discrimination against lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. Now, it's clear that your presence today reflects this shared commitment to advancing human rights, dignity, and equality for all. And it is also, in a way, part of our contribution to the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, of which I'm very proud to be the first woman Secretary General, has long been a leader in the promotion of the rights of LGBTI persons. We've been calling for their protection, and this commitment has really spanned over the decades. We have adopted numerous landmark resolutions. I would just quote some, for instance, freedom of expression and assembly of LGBTI people in Europe by Christophe Lacroix as rapporteur, or the promotion of human rights of and elimination of discrimination of intersex people by Peter De Bruyne. Most recently, in October, a groundbreaking resolution by your friend Beatriz Fresco-Rolfo, sitting on the right at the table, General Rapporteur on the rights of LGBTI people, so the light of the day. It's groundbreaking in the sense that this is the first time that an international body addressed violence against LBQ women, which is the subject exactly of our conference today. Now, these resolutions are not just words, are roadmaps for action in the future. I would have liked to quote some concrete measures from Beatrice's report, but I will let her do it in the most efficient way. Penelope already mentioned the placing of reports. I can tell you some years ago it would not have been so simple to place such a report in plenary. There was a tendency to discuss these issues in less big crowds, like what we call standing committees, etc. But I think over the last 2-3 years, our Assembly has really grown up in this subject matter, and in general, I would say, in gender sensitive issues. We are proud to announce that today we have half and half women and men. When I took over 3 years ago, it was 37% of women members of the Assembly. Through changes of the rules and changes in mentalities. I remember the UK delegation arguing they don't have enough women to send to Strasbourg. It really sounded weird. We managed now to have 50% of women members of the Assembly, not to talk about the Secretariat, where we are totally female-dominated. Now, at the heart of our efforts is a deep understanding that human rights are interconnected. So we work to address intersectionality, recognizing how gender, sexual orientation, race, disability, and economic status, very important, I think, intersect to create unique challenges for individuals. We aim to ensure that no one is left behind in our mission to build more inclusive and equitable societies. PACE's work does not end with our Assembly. It serves as a driver for broader change via national parliaments in member states. This is really the special characteristic of this Assembly I'm so proud of. We do not just speak here in Europe. All our parliamentarians bring our debates, our reflections back to the capitals in national parliaments. We are therefore proud that our efforts inspire not only the action of the Council of Europe itself, but also other international organizations and institutions. At the same time, we value strong cooperation with civil society organizations, particularly those that bring critical perspectives from the ground. And this is why I'm so happy to see so many actors from the civil society today. The creation of the PACE platform for the rights of LGBTI people, a parliamentary platform for this very specific issue, in 2022 exemplifies our commitment to collaboration and collective action, not only with intergovernmental bodies, but as I mentioned, with those on the front line for the fight of equality. Now, it is also important to celebrate the achievements of women in all their diversity. Penelope already mentioned the Victis Prize for Women Empowerment. This is a prize we launched in 2023, only last year, on the eve of the Reykjavik Summit, together with the Iceland chair. At that time, it was the Iceland presidency of the Council of Europe. The Icelandic Prime Minister signed this Victis Prize with our President of the Assembly, then Tini Cox. It was inspired by the first woman ever elected as president in the world, Vigdis Finnbogadóttir. We managed to learn her name because this woman is really a legend. And this was a recognition of courage, resilience, and contribution of women, including LBQ women across Europe and beyond. The prize is a powerful reminder of progress and achieved and progress that we still need by the voices and action of those who stand up for equality and women's empowerment. I encourage today everyone to apply, to think of nominations for the Victis Prize. We have just launched the edition for 2025, and the deadline is 28 March. Dear friends, today we have the opportunity to listen, learn, and build on each other's expertise. May everyone here engage openly, propose bold strategies, and strengthen our collective resolve to combat violence and discrimination against LBQ women. I'm sure that we will approach the conference with goodwill and a shared belief in the possibility of still progress. By working together, I believe we can ensure that all women, including LBQ, can live free from violence, discrimination, and fear. Thank you for your dedication, your voice, your action, and your unwavering commitment to the vital cause. Thank you. May I pass the floor to our Commissioner of Human Rights, Mr. Michael O'Flaherty.
Thank you very much, Despina. Good morning, everybody. And I want to thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. Sorry, I've got a frog in my throat, as we say. As I was thinking about what I'd say today, I found myself struggling, not for the first time, with the extraordinary paradox of humanity. On the one hand, our great richness, this species of human, is our diversity. I've of my whole life had the sense that that is what makes us so extraordinary, is so rich, so empowering for human beings. The fact that we are all so very different to each other, something to celebrate and to cherish. But then on the other hand of this paradox is that humanity invests so much effort in trying to destroy the diversity. There are so many efforts, persistent, constant, through history, to homogenize us, to somehow standardize us, to make us all some version of some sameness. Now, of course, all these efforts persistently fail. But as and when they fail, there then comes the effort to exclude. And there often it's very successful indeed. If you don't fit in, whoever is in control's notion of what the homogenized, standardized human should look like, then you're pushed to the edge, and even off the edge of society. Of course, this phenomenon, which has been with us forever, is profoundly in contradiction to respecting human dignity. And that means, to use the language of today, that is profoundly at odds with human rights. This is the house of human rights. And so therefore I so very much welcome the work that is now being done on the lived experience of LBQ women in the context of standing up for their human rights. I want to express again, not the first time this morning in terms of speakers, my deepest respect and appreciation for the report that was on preventing and combating violence and discrimination against lesbian, bisexual and queer women in Europe. As has been said, And as you know, this is globally groundbreaking. Yet again, I'm new to the Council of Europe. I can praise it a bit, still as an outsider. But yet again, Strasbourg leading the way on something which will eventually take on a global significance. And I really applaud that. I want to express the deepest of appreciation to Beatrice Fresco-Rolfo for her leadership in the Parliamentary Assembly in producing the report and forming the basis for resolutions of the Assembly. You know, the Assembly is an extraordinary place, and I'm not just saying it because I'm sitting beside Despina in an event being organised by the Assembly, but I had to get to know this organisation very well recently to appreciate what an extraordinary resource the Parliamentary Assembly is for human rights, for humanity. 4 times a year, the most extraordinary representation of our street politicians, and I say that deliberately because that's what's so special. Our street politicians are thrown together in all their diversity, in all their differences, and they find unity around so many critical themes. And by the way, Despina, you made the remark almost in passing, but it's astonishing to have a parliament where you can proudly say that it is 50% women. This is globally very rare. And people praise you. They say, well done, it's 30%. Well done, it's 35%. But how many reach 50? I really want to extol the importance of the pace, not just in the context of what we're discussing this morning. Now, coming back to our topic, I won't waste your time with facts and figures. You know them very well. You know them far better than me. Most of you are out there on the coalface dealing with the realities every single day. Let me simply refer to some of the primary data sources. I'm proud of the work my former agency, the Fundamental Rights Agency, has done in generating relevant data around the situation, not just regarding violence, but also of discrimination. I applaud the work of ILGA, which has consistently, year on year, generated evidence for us, which is vital to our work. And I express appreciation not just to them, but to all the other organisations, all of you who invest in capturing the lived experience and the reality. And by the way, increasingly with a profound grasp of the intersectional dimension, which is so acutely present for our discussion today. The intersectionality in the experience of LBQ women in the context of patterns, not just of discrimination and violence on grounds of sexual orientation, but also of misogyny, and then the compounding factors of the experience of being disabled, being Roma, being a migrant, is very, very acute indeed. But let me leave data and evidence about the reality there and get on to my shout-outs to states. Forgive me, I know there's not many state representatives here, so in a way I'm speaking to the wrong audience, but I'm still going to do it. There are 8 things that I would call on states to do now, do better, do right away. The first is that they have got to recognize, not just recognize the problem, not just recognize the challenge, not just work on it, but work on it with you. It is essential that the relevant civil society be deeply and respectfully involved in any actions by states of government in responding to patterns of violence and discrimination against LBQ women. It might seem obvious to us, but it very often is not the case. Second, we need to see a much bigger investment by states in gathering the data. If you don't measure it, you won't fix it. We do a bad job. It's not enough for EU member states to rely on the EU to gather the data, be it Eurostat, be it the Fundamental Rights Agency. And outside the European Union, very often nobody's gathering that data at the regional or sub-regional levels. But whether outside the EU or in the EU, there has to be a national investment in data gathering. Only at the national level will you get the granularity, the localised evidence to fix the situation. Third, and forgive me for being repetitious, but in any effort by states to engage the lived experience of LBQ women, this dimension of intersectionality has to be foremost. And you play, here in the room now, you play such an important role in helping states get intersectionality. It doesn't come intuitively. It has to be learnt. It has to be, people have to be confronted with it. It's such in a way, it's a dreadful word. It suggests a complexity and hides what all we're simply saying is just honour people as who they are. That's all it is. So in a way, if I have a lesser project in this goal, in this job, maybe it's to do away with the word so that people can get to the actual meaning behind it, which is so obvious. Fourth, we have to, our states and we have to mine the depths of international law in the protection of everybody in their own identity, in their own experience. I was the rapporteur for the first edition of the Yogyakarta Principles, which we developed in 2008. And that was a very deliberate exercise of experts and lawyers from across the world to breathe life into existing human rights law in defence of members of the LGBTIQ communities. That it wasn't just about non-discrimination, it wasn't just about not getting beaten up, it was about cherishing every dimension of who you are. Excuse me. And I think we were relatively successful. But that effort must not cease. There was a second edition of the Principles with which I was not involved, because by then I was working for the EU. But I would argue there's probably a need again for a third edition. Not to write new law, but just to expose the extent to which the existing standards protect us and need to be called on to protect us. And again, we have to insist that states take this approach. And this is the context, by the way, in which I deplore the anti-gender movements. The anti-gender movements are no less than a repudiation of international human rights law, be that the law of the Council of Europe or the law of the United Nations. And it is not, we cannot give some moral equivalence to the anti-gender movement. It is just not an alternative point of view. It is a call out for the violation of law, and that is why it is to be deplored. Fifth, we need, excuse me, while still talking of law, at the national level, we need strong domestic law in three areas, and it needs to be strengthened, I would say, just about everywhere. And that is our law combating discrimination, our laws regarding hate crime and violence, and the third one I want to mention because it maybe gets less attention, and that is the law in support of the victims of crime. This third dimension, I think, needs a light shone on it. And of course, once we get all the law in the world, we need it to be implemented. Because again, as we know from our societies, many of you come from countries with good legal regimes. If they're not enforced adequately, then they're just on paper. That brings me almost to the end, because I think this agitation is to tell me to stop.
No, some water.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm so mean, haven't I?
You're kinder than you think, Michael.
In my job, you spend your life looking at the moderator, willing them not to tell you to stop talking. But the sixth of my eight has to do with the implementation of the law, and that's tackling prejudice and intolerance and bias in our law enforcement. I once asked somebody why the reporting of crime against LGBTIQ people is so massively underreported. I was told very simply, why should I report a homophobic act to a homophobe? And this is a simple reality. Homophobia and all the related phobias are prevalent across society, including within the communities of those who enforce law, who investigate, who prosecute, who adjudicate. And so it's very important to invest and reinvest in awareness raising and promoting tolerance across all of these communities. Seventh of my eight, I'm Irish, and I spoke of a paradox at the beginning. We have a paradox in Ireland. We have some of the most progressive law on earth, but we still have serious degrees of intolerance in our society. And I don't really understand how we keep voting for the right thing, but then we do the wrong thing. But that's a simple experience. And it's the point here is we have to invest and keep investing in promoting tolerance in our societies. I mean, if something very positive to learn from the Irish experience is that when you confront people with their own intolerance and you do it smartly, you can actually make enormous progress, but you have to keep doing it. So we have to work in our societies. And eighth and finally, coming back to all of us here actually, not states at all, and I would say we have to be very cautious and very vigilant, but I think we can be hopeful. I don't think there's any point in us meeting here this morning were it not for the fact that we can make things better. The sun has just come out. That's a symbol of hope. But I don't want to make a joke out of this. Let me just come back to those moments of achievement. Look at that Irish case I gave you. For all the problems still in the society, the law reforms, the referendum changes have been quite astonishing. Much of this has been promoted by initiatives, stories that began here in Strasbourg. The Irish story of liberation, if you want to call it that, began with two great cases of the European Court of Human Rights, the Norris case and the UK case. It's gone out of my head. What is it again? Dudgeon. Yeah, it's like when you have an old friend and you're blank on their name when they're in front of you. The Dudgeon and the Norris cases were the beginning of the story which led to the situation we have in Ireland today. So that's not just a reminder. We can be hopeful about specific countries, but we can also be hopeful about initiatives to start here in the Council of Europe. They can, given the time, given the attention, given our strong, persistent investment, they can actually bring about enormous change right across our societies. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And the last of our three champions is Lady Phil. You have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And how are we today? I should say bonjour. Should I speak in French or English? Yeah, because I can't speak French very well. So
you should have taken her up on that.
Yeah. So, look, Penelope, thank you so much, and it's great to be on such a platform with Despina, Michael, and of course Bella. We were in South Africa together, and the amazing Beatrice, who, of course, with the reports and the resolutions. I guess I come from a very different aspect to what Michael was talking about, but of course there are such shared commonalities in what's being said. You know, I sit here before you as a black African lesbian woman who works not just in the UK and has founded UK Black Pride, which seeks to work with refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, different people from different walks of life who are often the most underrepresented and marginalised in society. And this isn't a race or a hierarchy for the biggest oppression, but this is about really recognising that whilst we are all aiming and seeking to fight for equality, freedom and justice under the guises of how our bodies and our minds are treated when it comes to the violence and the discriminations that we feel, we are actually different. And it's okay to recognize those differences, because if I'm speaking about, say, some of the colonial era laws that have impacted our lives, it means that my lived experience may be very different to Bella's lived experience, even though we may both still experience misogyny, misogynoir, the discrimination, the sexism. And when we start to look at the intersections of those, my intersections compounded with, say, race, gender, class, or even gender expressions, we have to look at really how those discriminations play out and live out and what we put in place to support them. And, you know, I don't want to highlight that I believe I may be one of or the only black African woman in this room. So whilst we're doing well to highlight and champion these things, we must have more voices from different backgrounds being able to speak truth to power about the experiences that we face. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves coming back to the drawing board, trying to understand why we have been all seen as this homogenous community or being seen as a monolith. So I guess I put my notes down. Look, that's probably 8 minutes already, but I put my notes down because I know I can digress and I can talk a lot. So if you start winking at me, I know that it's not that you fancy me, it's that we have to actually wrap up. So look, it is an absolute privilege to be able to address you here on, I guess, the collective attention and the actions that's required and the unique challenges faced by women, in addition to the enduring gender-based violence and systemic inequalities, and also the experiences of discrimination and violence that is rooted around sexual orientation, race and class. I guess when we speak about gender-based violence, we often acknowledge the pervasive nature, yet women like me who live at the intersection of multiple identities, this violence is compounded and absolutely layered and further entrenched by other oppressions that amplify a vulnerability and also an invisibility. If you take, for example, a black woman in a working or low-income environment, she not only faces the indignities of sexism, but is also subjected to racism in institutions that are meant to protect her, and also the homophobia that questions her very existence. I think for discrimination, that experience is not a singular experience, it's one of an all-encompassing reality. And then we start to think about the intersectionality of the oppressions. When Professor Kimberly Crenshaw coined the word intersectionality, it taught us that those views were interconnected systems of oppression and not strands of overlapping forces. In practice, what this means is that a black woman or a woman of colour who identifies as queer may find herself excluded in feminist spaces and movements for being queer, or sidelined in LGBTQ+ spaces for being a woman, or rendered invisible in racial justice campaigns for being both. Gender-based violence is often exacerbated in these intersections that we see. Women of marginalised sexualities and genders, and also gender identities, are disproportionately targeted for so-called, and I say so-called, corrective rape and so-called honour-based violence and family rejection. And much of my work spans dealing with many of our siblings and our comrades that are facing these levels of violence, not just within Europe, but also internationally. I am part of a group called TCEN, TCEN, that's the Commonwealth Equality Network, and it was great to hear you talk about the Yogyakarta principles, because TCEN was born out of a need to look at how LGBT plus groups within a Commonwealth based on colonial era laws are navigating particular systems that oppress them based on draconian like sodomy laws that prevent them from getting jobs, safe access to housing, to health and so forth. I guess also when we talk about class disparities, this means that many women on low-income communities lack access, as I was saying, to safe housing, legal counsel, or even financial resource to escape abusive environments. I speak of my own example. When I came out over 29 years ago, I had to go into a safe housing. And that safe housing no longer exists today in the UK because of various cuts. And I know Kate Osborne, our MP from the UK, can speak about the austerity impacts that have happened, that I was one of the fortunate women that was able to have baby in tow and be in a safe house. But today that safe house does not exist. So how does one flee from an abusive situation or gender-based violence when those resources are not available for us? We also know for queer women, these barriers are often magnified by a familiar rejection and the absence and loss of community support. So I think, despite these challenges, us as women, as allies, as supporters, as advocates, as NGOs, as charities, and also those who are parliamentarians, who I believe you walk through the corridors of power to make and effect these changes, we have to think differently, and we have to think that we are not just victims, we are survivors, leaders, change makers, and across the globe, women at all of these intersections are building grassroots movements, like UK Black Pride, which Penelope mentioned earlier. These grassroots movements are challenging harmful norms in advocating for inclusive policies, like we've read through the report and also the resolution, Beatrice, so thank you again for that. But organisations like UK Black Pride should remind us of the strength found in collective action and the importance of creating spaces where marginalised voices lead. I mentioned allyship. Now, allyship must be rooted in solidarity, but allyship has to be more than just solidarity. It requires action. It means that we must push for greater policies that acknowledge intersectionality, and not intersectionality as a buzzword or a synonym for diversity, really looking at those forms of oppressions. It means that it must be a framework for justice. It means that it must be advocating for culturally competent services, ensuring that there are shelters, healthcare systems, schools that recognise the unique needs of women of colour and other such marginalised groups. So I guess the path forward, and I will be wrapping up, Penelope, but the path forward, to address some of these needs for women effectively, we must adopt a multifaceted approach. And of course, again, I stress, we have the report, the resolution, and we need to utilise that and not just let it be a report that sits on a table that we push from side to side. One of that most multifaceted approach has to be around education, challenging societal norms that perpetuate homophobia, biphobia, and queerphobia, and sexism, and of course racism. 2, there has to be policy, strong policy reform which pushes laws that explicitly protect against intersecting forms of discrimination and violence. And much of that violence and discrimination has to be unpacked and not just seen as a linear approach to dealing with it. 3, it has to be as resources, and Michael mentioned resourcing. Resource allocation, the funding of organisations has to be led by and for marginalised women. Often we are seeing that any form of aid, any form of support going into the advocacy work of NGOs and charities is diminishing, and is diminishing fast. And we can't actually do this work on fresh air and thin air. Many of these organisations that are led by women for marginalised groups and communities often are facing really stringent ways of dealing with an already oppressive system in working within these institutions. And I would say 4, this is about representation. And I think representation, as I mentioned at the beginning, being a black African lesbian woman, I don't want to be the one speaking on behalf of everybody. Whilst I am absolutely honoured and privileged to be in this space, I think it's about opening up the doors, opening up those spaces, rearranging the tables and passing the mic to many other people that can't be here. And it's about ensuring that women are represented in leadership roles like Despina's role, like Beatrice, like Bella's, like our parliamentarians, like Penelope's, and making sure that we support those women in leadership roles to do what they need to do to keep on opening the doors. So in conclusion, I guess what I'm doing and what I'm asking for is that I'm urging you all to be true to progress, because progress doesn't come with just addressing the issues in a siloed form. It comes with understanding that the fight for gender equality and gender parity is inseparable from the fight for racial justice, is inseparable from the fight for even climate justice, is inseparable from the many different things that compound our lives and how we navigate that. And it's inseparable for the fight for economic equality. So when we centre the most marginalised and underrepresented in our communities, and we not only uplift them, we strengthen the very foundation of our movements and of justice and equality. So together, I guess, we are here as we're speaking, and we're going to have this amazing conference and hear from some amazing speakers and have a wonderful panel. We're here to really look at the urgency, but let's add some compassion into this with that unwavering belief of the power of intersectionality and how we truly navigate spaces and institutions where historically we have not occupied. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lady Phil. It's really inspiring as well as being thought-provoking for us here today. All of you, thank you so much, the three champions of this morning's meeting. And now, without further ado, I will give the floor to the moderator of the first session, Bella Fitzpatrick, and we will hear from parliamentarians and other speakers, and I will let now the moderator moderate as she's been asked to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Penelope. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, it's all right? Okay, thank you so much. I think I'm very delighted to be even a small part of addressing violence and discrimination against LBQ women in Europe. I think this is an extremely important topic. I was thinking about that last night when I left my hotel to go grab a little bit of dinner, and a man decided to follow me for a couple of streets. I ignored my repeated attempts to tell him I didn't particularly want to chat. This is not an unusual turn of events. It's not something that anybody will find that surprising. It just happens all the time. It didn't escalate, but there's always that feeling that it might. And that's just a reality that we live with every day. So I am the executive director of IGLIO, the International LGBT Youth and Student Organization, representing 128 member organizations across 40 countries. And I always come to these things with a youth perspective. Despite my advanced age, I still have the youth perspective, as is my mandate. So we do see higher rates of hate crime and hate speech amongst young LBQ women and girls than their older counterparts, and this tends to be quite normalized in society. If it happens to an adult, it's harassment, but if it happens to a young person, it's bullying and just part of growing up. I hope we can challenge that normalization and ensure that youth voices are also included in policy making, as their voices are often silenced. I'm delighted to be joined by this panel, but my name is Bella Fitzpatrick, but that is the English version of my name. My name is Bella Ní Fodric, but I would not foist that upon ye. However, a combination of being both Irish and dyslexic means I'm very nervous about pronouncing the panelists' names, but I'm going to do my best. My tactic is normally to go very fast, which is also a common Irish trait. Which reminds me of a joke. How do you know that someone's Irish? They'll tell you. We tend to bring it up a lot. It tends to be very core to everything we do, partly just because of how strongly we feel of our identity. So I'm really delighted to be here with this panel. Beatrice Fresco-Roffel, the PACE General Rapporteur on the Rights of LGBT People. Dragana Torovorovich, the Executive Director of the Euro-Asian Lesbian Community. Caterina Bolognese, it's okay, the Head of the Gender Equality Division. Marie Patoulet, French Paralympian medalist, and Anastasia Gergomenko from Insight Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining me. Beatrice, I would like to join the chorus of people thanking you for the resolution, and I will go to you first. You were the rapporteur for the resolution on preventing and combating violence and discrimination against LBQ women in Europe, adopted recently, and the first ever resolution to explicitly address the rights of queer women. Can you tell us a little bit about the key elements involved? We would love to hear more.
Thank you very much, Bella. We need some French here, so just to let you know you can get to your things because I'm going to speak French. Alors, d'abord, j'aimerais vous...
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank you all, not just women, there are men here. I'd like to thank you all for being here at this joint conference on LGBTI persons' rights. And if I'm speaking too quickly, then I shall stop a moment and allow you to put your headsets on. Is everyone all right? Yes, can you hear me now? If the English speaker is on at the rostrum, can you hear me now? Okay, that's a yes. There's a nod there. So, I just wanted to say to Lady Fee, I hope that this report will be applied. As you said, we don't want a report to just stay on a table and go from, door to door. So, I am the rapporteur for LGBTI persons, but also the rapporteur of the report that was presented in October that was approved on the prevention of violence and discrimination of LBQ women in Europe. This was adopted by the Assembly with a large majority, and at last we have a text that has been adopted on a political level which shows our support and our recognition of the specific challenges that LBQ women are faced with. So this is the first text that's been adopted on an international level on this very issue. I'd like to say on a personal level that I've really loved working on this subject. I've really met some extraordinary activists, really amazing. And I also want to thank the Secretariat, Lady Fisher, to thank for her for the support, her support. We're just checking that the interpretation is working. Can any English speaker raise their hands to let the interpreter? Can you hear us okay? Brilliant. Okay. No. If you can hear me now, are you fine? Brilliant. Okay. Yes, for once I can do it in French. So, to start off, we saw that still today LBQ women were really rendered invisible, whether it be in the fight for LGBTI women or whether it's also for women's rights, and that's something that we've already heard by other speakers. Intersectional discrimination is ignored, and there's a stereotypical image of LBQ women is almost systematically presented in the media. I therefore decided to embark on research work. I organised hearings at the Commission. I had many bilateral meetings. I even went on an information trip in Rome in June this year, where I met many representatives, senators, and also members of Parliament, government authorities, and also members of civil society. Now, reports of the reporters of the Assembly are relatively short, but they try to give as great an overview as they can, and I think you were able to see that when you read the report. Now, this is when we hope this will be applied. Now, our ambition is not to be completely exhaustive, entirely exhaustive, but rather to raise awareness of certain questions, to be there to contribute to debate and to ensure that laws are adopted on a national level and to shed light on certain subjects. The text that has been adopted by the Assembly is not legally binding, and I regret this, but it nonetheless gives political recognition and is indeed a call to action. And it also allows parliamentarians, when they go home, they go, aha, this is something that I can then show to my government and encourage them to put something in place. This report allowed us to see that LBQ women are faced with stigmatisation and discrimination that is founded on gender, their sexual orientation, as well as their specific identity, as they are women who do not comply with what society awaits from them and stereotypical roles that one associates with gender and so-called norms of femininity. They can be victims of physical violence, verbal violence, psychological violence, and so-called honour crimes. But all of this is to punish them and tell them to just deal with it or control their body. They are particularly targeted today by anti-gender movements who are attacking women's rights and also LGBTI women's and want to reduce them to silence or indeed negate their legitimacy in the public space. And indeed we will hear this a little bit further from my colleague in the next panel. In the adopted resolution, the Parliamentary Assembly denounced the instrumentalisation of LGBTI people's rights for political means and hate discourse. It deplores actions undertaken by state structures that aim to undermine LGBTI women including LBQ women, such as, for example, the support of anti-equality demonstrations, or indeed the adoption of decrees or laws that want to restrict their rights or indeed prevent the dissemination of information. The Assembly also recognises that transgender, lesbians and LBQ racialised women are also particularly subject to violence, sexism, racism, biophobia, transphobia, lessophobia that can lead to a multitude of discrimination. And it's true that what we try to see is that heteronormativity must stop, and the protection of the rights of LGBTI women, including LBQ women, does not in any way impinge upon the rights of other people. The marriage for all, for example, is but an example. The fact that for some states they do not recognise marriage of same-sex couples who are married abroad gives rise to what? Familial instability, parental discrimination, and daily administrative problems. These discriminations are also frequent when it comes to health or housing or employment. These barriers must be removed. Prejudice, ignorance, stigmatisation must stop, and I am convinced that parliamentarians have a role to play to this end, and perhaps with LBQ women at the helm. It is also important to invest in education for equality, and you have already mentioned this. Now, in concrete terms, the Assembly calls on the Member States of the Council of Europe to adopt, finance and implement national strategies for the protection of LGBTI persons, prepared in cooperation with organisations that represent these LGBTI people, because it's very important when you do this, and specific measures for women, for intersectionality. They have to implement solid legislation against discrimination and ensure that they have the necessary specific provisions on discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression and sex. Adopt a zero-tolerance policy on hate crimes and hate speech against LGBTI persons, including LBQ women, to prosecute and, where appropriate, punish perpetrators of violence motivated by prejudice. Repeal legislative and constitutional amendments designed to restrict the rights and freedoms of LGBTI women, persons, including LBQ women, and to prohibit conversion practices and forced sterilisation. Guarantee access to information for all on diversity of sexual orientations, gender identities, gender expressions and sex characteristics, to combat disinformation campaigns on LBQ women, and to repeal anti-LGBTI propaganda laws. Because, of course, they are really, seeing a huge resurgence in many countries. Recognise the parental rights of the second parent in same-sex couples in the child's best interest, and always in the child's best interest. Recognise the right of same-sex couples, or at least to contract a civil union giving them access to the same rights as marriage, because this will allow some countries in the recommendations, which is different from marriage but gives people still the same access. Protect freedom of expression and support gay pride, and to ensure that diversity of profiles is always respected. The list that I have is not, of course, exhaustive. In fact, there's a longer list you can find on the site. But these recommendations, all these recommendations, should of course be followed by fact. We have to fight lesbophobia in all strata of society. I think we're all convinced of this. And to create an environment where everyone, irrespective of their sexual orientation, may live in security without being isolated and with dignity. Collective mobilisation and the desire to change are fundamental to build a world that will be more inclusive, more equitable, in which all identities will be respected. And I think that's maybe almost my final word. I've always loved the fact that, we've talked about sunshine, this hope that is there. So I think it is important to ensure that we promote and protect everyone's rights, everyone's identity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Dragana, I will go to you to follow up. What can concretely be done to implement the positive outcomes of the LBQ report from your perspective and ELC?
Thank you, Bella. I'm very happy and honored to be here for a number of reasons. I will start by introducing myself just briefly. I'm the Executive Director of ELC, Euro Central Asian Lesbian Community. We are a network of now over 160 LBQ women's organizations from across Europe and Central Asia, and several thousand individual members. And I will get to your question by also starting by saying how rare these opportunities are that we have right here. This event right here that focuses on LBQ women from the policy perspective are extremely rare. Just 2-3 years ago, they were unimaginable. And we, as a network of LBQ women, since the moment we were established, we set this as one of our primary goals, to mainstream LBQ women's needs, interests, and priorities everywhere, to have a seat at the table where decisions are being made and discussed about us, including events and meetings such as this one. And I can tell you that this process in the past couple of years was very difficult. It was very difficult to have a seat at the table. It was very difficult to have our voices heard and to explain why we need to focus specifically on the lived experiences of LBQ women, because institutions and other stakeholders were looking at us as an LGBTI community very often from this, as was mentioned, homogenizing and monolithic perspectives. And as we were trying to get our messages across, we were even, I could even say the word accused of splitting up the movement, of dividing the movement, while it was actually the opposite. It actually strengthens our rights and our movements if we address every single diversity and intersectionality that we have within our movement. We cannot hope to be strong as a community and also strong as policymakers and institutions if we leave someone behind and if we exclude women of our community. We as LBQ women, I myself, I'm a lesbian. I come from Serbia. I'm also of a Romani ethnical origin, so intersectionality is a very important matter to me personally, but also, of course, professionally. And we cannot hope to have good policies and to have good movements if some of us are excluded. And given the intersection of gender and sexual orientation and gender expression, where we as LBQ women are located at, this intersection between women's rights and LGBTIQ rights, the intersection between women's rights movements and LGBTIQ movements, between women's rights policies, gender equality policies, and LGBTIQ policies, meant, given that this intersectionality was largely deprioritized, marginalized, invisibilized for far too long, meant that we were falling through the cracks all the time. And this resolution that we are talking about today is an example of how there is progress, and that we have, as an organization and as a movement, achieved some steps in putting a stop to this. ELC was the one to initiate this resolution, and we are very happy and grateful that the Council of Europe and PACE were kind enough to listen to us and kind enough to take our suggestions and our messages forward and bring it to this resolution. And we see this resolution as a starting point, as a door opener. Given that it's so groundbreaking, as was mentioned several times, this is the first and only international human rights standard document that focuses exclusively on LBQ women. This for our work as ELC and for our member organizations will be key to open the doors to convince the decision makers and policy makers at the national and local level that this is indeed a relevant topic, that this intersectionality indeed has to be taken in account, because the real lived life experiences and consequences of this intersection of sexism, misogyny, lesbophobia, and also transphobia and biphobia have real, grave, and numerous consequences in almost any walk of life, whether it is, or any part of our lives, whether it is public or private, gender-based violence, honor killings, corrective rapes, hate speech, hate crime, stigma and discrimination in every possible way, access to education, access to employment, access to healthcare services, and so on. So this resolution and this report, given that it is coming from the Council of Europe, will help us in reaching out and convincing national and local authorities that this perspective is important. Many of the countries and member states of Council of Europe have gender equality action plans and gender equality strategies, and also some of them, an increasing a number of them, also has LGBTIQ policies and action plans. And I think this resolution will help us as an organization, but also member states in terms of implementation, of making sure that these policies that are existing or are being drafted or will be drafted take a perspective, a unique and targeted perspective of LBQ women as well. So I think from the implementation side, this is key. And I think also there is another element or another aspect from the perspective of implementation, how this could be used. And I think this resolution can also be used to inspire jurisprudence. So if there is a court focusing, and there is a case focusing on LBQ women, the European Court of Human Rights can take some perspectives from this resolution, and this could influence their decision making, and in effect also this resolution as a result could also influence the decisions of the court and its jurisprudence. And I will stop here for now, but I know you have other questions for me for later, so I'll save some for later.
Thank you so much. Katerina, I'll come to you now. The role of the Gender Equality Division in terms of mainstreaming gender equality to all the Council of Europe policies, and to bridge the gap between commitments made at the international level and the reality of women in Europe. Could you tell me a little about what the division's doing to bring the perspective of LBQ women into this gender mainstreaming?
Thank you so much. And let me also commend Beatriz Fresco-Rolfo, but also the village behind her for this amazing the report and the resolution. I'm the head of the Gender Equality Division, and we service the intergovernmental part of the work of the Council of Europe in the area of gender equality. And we have a program on gender mainstreaming throughout the work of the organization, and which goes tries to go deep into each sector's activity, and we encounter receptiveness, interest, lukewarm interest. It's a constant dance that we try to play, not competitively, but we're winning, I think. In any case, I really want to talk to you today about intersectionality, and the biggest contribution of the Gender Equality Division is through the work of the Gender Equality Commission and its standard setting work. I want to speak about intersectionality also because and policy making, the subject matter of the panel, and I was very interested to hear our excellent commissioner speak of possibly abandoning the word intersectionality because it's uncomfortably complicated, and I was reminded of the fact that when I think the first standard of the Council of Europe that squarely mentions intersectionality is our sexism recommendation from 2019. It is the very first internationally agreed legal definition of sexism, what it contains, the forms it represents, and sexism presents, and intersectionality is part of this recommendation on how to prevent and combat sexism. And when it was adopted, because of the references to intersections and references to the Court of Human Rights, the Convention on Human Rights, the question came at the moment of adoption, well, what is intersectionality? And there I was having to field this question and admitting that at the time of the adoption of the European Convention on Human Rights, intersectionality wasn't a thing. Professor Crenshaw hadn't yet spoken, nor had it been explored to the depth that she began, but also people standing on her shoulders continued. And it is a very, very, very important concept that we've embraced through our standards, and most notably through the sexism recommendation, but recently, most importantly, through the gender equality strategy. This third gender equality strategy of the Council of Europe, adopted in March of this year, is the text that where we have tried and succeeded to basically mainstream an intersectional approach throughout all of the 6 strategic objectives, and this in a climate and context that is not gender equality friendly. Let's put it very clearly. The Council of Europe has a priority, has as a priority gender equality, but it's a very difficult subject matter on which to get our 46 members to agree, and agreed, however they have, on a text which is very strong and on in particular on this intersectional approach. The strategy includes a very comprehensive list of discrimination grounds in this context of intersectionality, and this very fact that it has a very extensive, non-exhaustive, but explicit and extensive list of discrimination grounds is a tool within in itself, because it clamours for not leaving those behind who are listed in this list of grounds, right? It is, I think, the best possible result we were able to achieve in this climate, and achieved by the 46 member states, rallied, however, by observer organisations, without which it would have been very difficult as well to achieve this result. And as I said, the approach runs throughout the entire strategy. We have, for example, in the mainstreaming part of the strategy, the title has been changed as compared to previous strategies, and it includes achieving gender mainstreaming and including an intersectional approach in all policies and measures. Wonder whether we're good for time. Yeah. What the strategy doesn't include is a silver bullet on how to achieve this intersectional approach. And so what's really, really important is a resolution such as has recently been adopted, exemplifying how you do it for LBQ women. This is a great approach. It's not clear to me how you do it for everyone, so you leave no one behind. This perhaps we can talk about. But definitely bringing to the fore a much maligned, much forgotten group. This is one way of unpacking intersectional discrimination and adopting an intersectional approach in combating it. The strategy, for example, without giving the how-to solutions, nevertheless does make many references that are relevant for LBQ women. We have a recommendation to member states to cooperate with the relevant sectors and organisation to remove discrimination, sexism and gender stereotypes affecting one or more particular groups of women, including LGBTI women. It recommends to incorporate this intersectional approach in the national strategies to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence. It recommends to gather further information with the support of feminist civil society organisations and to build knowledge about the specific forms of violence faced by certain groups, such as women with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. And recommends to develop and disseminate information tools about the main Council of Europe instruments to promote women's access to justice, taking into account the needs of women and girls who face additional barriers due to their intersecting identities, such as LGBTI women. The strategy also stresses that some groups of women, notably LGBTI women, face particular challenges, including greater difficulty in joining the labour market, higher levels of precariousness, and related risks of poverty and social exclusion. A great challenge is represented by sex-based discrimination and sexist behaviours within the justice system, and sometimes even the laws themselves, and this particularly affects certain groups of women and girls, such as LGBTI women. And as has been mentioned before, and also by the PACE resolution, anti-gender movements are also addressed. We also address them in our strategy. The rise of the anti-gender movements weakens existing acquis of rights, and these movements seek to limit, among other things, women's access to health services, including sexual and reproductive health and rights, and protections for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex persons. LBQ women are uniquely positioned at the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination. Anti-gender movements not only target their rights as women, but also their identities as sexual minorities. And this double burden often results in heightened vulnerabilities to violence, to exclusion, and to economic insecurity. So combating anti-gender rhetoric means addressing these intersecting challenges head-on and ensuring that LBQ women are central to policy-making processes and solutions. Anti-gender movements often disproportionately target LBQ women by perpetuating stereotypes that question their legitimacy in societal and family structures. For example, legislative efforts to restrict recognition of same-sex partnerships directly harm LBQ women by denying them rights related to family, health, and inheritance.
Thank you. I think I might need to stop
okay,
there.
thank you. Yes,
I just want to have a final sentence.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that we are also embarking on 2 new standards. One on equality and artificial intelligence. Together with our anti-discrimination colleagues, we will produce a recommendation on that will address the impact as well as the opportunities presented by artificial intelligence. And of course, it will have an intersectional approach. And most importantly, we are producing a recommendation on tech-facilitated violence against women. Both of these by the end of next year. And of course, there as well, LBQ women being a target, a particular target of tech-facilitated violence. They will form part of the reflection around this text. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It seems like intersectionality is the word of the day for sure. So I'll go to Marie. As a Paralympic lesbian athlete, you've likely faced the effects of intersection forms of oppression. What has your experience been, and what do you think of the role of institutions like the ones represented here have in the protection of the rights of LBQ women in sports specifically? Thank you.
Yes, and I'll be speaking in French. Apologies in advance. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today to speak to you and to speak about these issues particularly. I would have preferred that to have a black lesbian athletes come speak to you, so that the list of discriminations would be even longer and that the privilege even shorter than mine. So I'm a French athlete, I'm a lesbian, I am disabled, and I think that the best example to talk about intersectional discriminations in sport is the Paralympic and Olympic Games of Paris of a few months ago, which was really a good showcasing of inclusion, and I think a good way to rehash all this hatred that still exists around the LGBT community in general, and particularly LBQ women. I think one example that speaks for itself is Iman Khalif, who clearly does not present herself or identify as an LBQ woman, but she suffered from a wave of lesbophobia, racism, transphobia, which was quite horrible. And just from a more personal point of view, as a French athlete, what I realized is that the link between lesbophobia is clearly linked to misogyny and homophobia. As soon as you start fighting against sexism and fighting against this very normative definition of a woman in society, then you have to let women be who they are, and therefore have their own sexual orientations, and therefore this will improve the fight against lesbophobia. I participated in the Tokyo Games as well. I came back with 2 bronze medals, which was an amazing success for me. And yes, I was destroyed by sexist, lesbophobic behavior that I encountered, and having not been able to be myself there. So when I went to the Paris Games, I had an agreement with my coach. The goal was to go to Paris, but that I would keep some of my energy to fight against sexism and to fight against LGBT phobia, which exists, at least in France, in my sport. So that would mean that some of my energy could not be dedicated to the training. And what happened is that at the end I was in Paris with the same people as I was with in Tokyo, so the same people who had shown lesbophobia, sexism towards me 3 years earlier. But after 3 years of exhausting efforts, I have to be honest, now I have nothing to say to these people in the organization of the game. So of course those were home games, so much more media. I was given a microphone much more, and everybody knew that if I had encountered any issues, I would have talked about it in the media. But I had nothing wrong to say about these people, and this was true for me and for all my co-athletes in the French team. So that's a positive already. Now, what I do still regret, and that's kind of what I was saying at the beginning of my intervention, hoping that someone else than me could have been here today, someone who faces even more discrimination, to talk about intersectionality. Sports is supposed to be universal, and yet there is so little representation in sports. And if there is no representation, there is no place. And for us to talk about intersectionality, they need to be represented. We can't just have white, lesbian, non-disabled in sport. We need more diversity, including in the representation of the LGBTI community. So we need to be represented, and intersectionality needs to be represented more. I've talked about sexism, I've talked about lesbophobia, racism, discrimination against disability, but there's also issues of religion. I was really appalled when my own country forbid Muslim athletes to participate with head coverings. So, sorry, I'm a bit confused in all the issues I'm mentioning, but it's all about representation, which is absolutely crucial to giving a place to these people. High-level sport is such an inspiration for low-level sport, grassroots-level sport, but also the rest of society. That's why we need more representativity and representation in national teams. Otherwise, it'll be hard to launch a broader movement in the rest of society. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Anastasia, I would love to speak to you in terms of your experience supporting LBQ women during the full-scale war in Ukraine. What can policymakers do to bear in mind the impact of women during wartime, during conflict? What can policymakers bear in mind for that, and some of the challenges you faced in this time?
Hi, everyone. Before starting, I approached Dragana and confessed I'm a little bit nervous. And she gave me an advice. She said, "Don't worry, just talk about lesbians." and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm a representative on Inside organization. It's one of the biggest organizations in Ukraine. And we have always provided a broad spectrum of support to LGBT people. However, we was a humanitarian or volunteer organization. The full-scale war in Ukraine, in Ukraine, forced us to rapidly adapt and modify our ways of helping LGBT people under rapidly changing conditions and circumstances. We began housing people in shelters. We opened 3 shelters in western Ukraine. We started to provide 3 times more psychological support, and we began to distribute directly humanitarian aid, supplying everything people need to survive. And you know what? We opened a request form for assistance, and the majority of those who applied were men. Can you imagine, out of 100 requests, 19 could be from men, specifically gay men. How do you think why? Because lesbians, women say, "I'm okay, I'm fine, I'm alive, that's enough." Maybe someone else probably needs it more. They also say that it's embarrassing to ask for help. Lesbians are accustomed to relying only on themselves, actually. Lesbians reach out when they are completely out of any resources, and only when the help is needed not for themselves, but for their children, parents, pets. That's when they reach out. And yes, they ask for help not for themselves, but for others. This is about female socialization, the vulnerability of women and lesbians, and how we've been taught to care for everyone else first. I want to add here the fact that the first one who rushed to help were LC, because lesbians always help lesbians. And we can rely on each other. One friend from our friends from EOC, and Dragana was one of them, immediately came to the Polish border, asked us what was needed, bought it, and sent it to us, and helped people with accommodation abroad, so on. And yes, a lot of lesbians left the country in the first year, in 2022. We don't have exact statistics for obvious reasons, but on our experience, the work of our shelters and our humanitarian efforts, we can surmise that the majority of lesbians with children moved abroad, and most likely they may not return in the near future. They chose the safety of their children and the possibility of giving them a future in a country where they are recognized as a family. In Ukraine, we have been fighting for those rights for many years, and we all want happiness here and now, especially when people have children. So there is no judgment, just a deeply sense of sadness, but we continue our fight so that those families can return to Ukraine and live as a family, recognized by the state as a family, because they are a family. And the second point I want to mention, it's about survivors of sexual violence. So we all know that the women become one of the most vulnerable groups suffering from its consequences. And also women often serve as trophies in war, just like centuries ago when invaders conquered a country, one of the actions involved exploitation of women. Today, in Ukraine, women are suffering from sexual violence. Yeah. Having a hotline for psychological service, we began to encounter outcries from women who have suffered. Talking about lesbians who escaped from occupied areas, they often did everything possible to hide their lesbian identity, because it added risks to their physical safety. At some point, international media began to focus on such cases or to broadcast them internationally. And this became somewhat horrific for us, actually. The demand to present a victim became commonplace. They said, give us a victim. It was horrible. The way journalists wanted to interview women who had suffered or who had survived sexual violence seemed like a terrible approach. They asked for phone numbers, photographs, if possible, and so on. This was shocking for us because this approach is not human. At the same point, we realized that for many international organizations and committees, a primary focus became the statistics regarding women who suffered from sexual violence. In meetings concerning the empowerment of LBQ women in Ukraine, the interest ultimately boiled down to how many of those women had been victims of sexual violence. We were asked for statistics, case descriptions, and the focus was solely on those aspects. It's not about dignity. This approach fails to acknowledge how difficult it is for women to speak about what they have injured and challenges they face, and the shame culture associated with being a victim. approach to provide assistance from international organizations, often based not on what women actually need, but on what they think they need. For instance, we were sent women's kits, and these kits included like nail polish, or some small mirror, or lips balm, or reusable pads, you know, because a lot of cities in Ukraine don't have enough water. but we say that there is often not enough water, but we are not, but it not helps. That is why it is so important to change this approach from victims to survivors, and start from collecting local needs first, and then build programs of support which should be based on humanity. So I want to say, come to women and ask women and support women.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So very quickly, because I would love to open it to the floor, but just before I do, and go back to Dragana very quickly, we've heard about the resolve of the lesbian community, and we know that ELC does a lot to build the capacity to, maybe you would say, maximize the lesbian genius. So what is the role of lesbian civil society organizations in this work? And I'll ask you to be brief, as we do want to hear from the floor if anybody has questions.
Of course, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I know we're running out of time, and as I think I mentioned in my previous part, I think there wouldn't be this resolution and this report if it hadn't been for ELC and our member organizations. It was us who initiated, it was us who had this idea. It took some years for this to happen, but we are very happy that we played a crucial role in initiating it, in also working hand in hand with PACE in the preparation of the report and the resolution, and making sure that the consultative processes that were taking place in preparation of the resolution were inclusive of our communities in all of their diversities, and we worked closely with Beatrice, making sure that our members, member organizations, are speaking to Beatrice about their experiences, especially in Italy, as was mentioned. And I think one additional role of the civil society, of ELC and our member organizations, is now on the level of implementation, which I think is now the crucial part. As we said, we don't want this document to just be, just a document that stays somewhere in our drawers and nothing happens. And I will just name several key things that we will do as ELC together with our lesbian member organizations. So our first role as an umbrella lesbian network would be to inform our membership in detail about this resolution and what this brings potentially to the national level in the way they speak and have a dialogue with national authorities on all levels nationally. We will create concrete recommendations and concrete step-by-step guidances for member states on how this could fit into their existing or forthcoming legislative processes, and also processes for different strategies and action plans as they relate to gender equality and LGBTI rights. And in order to do that, we have already done last year an analysis of the implementation of the Istanbul Convention in relation to LBQ women. And just now we are starting for the entire Europe an analysis of gender equality strategies and action plans, and LGBTI equalities and strategies and action plans to see if LBQ issues are mainstream there. We of course already know that they're not, but this analysis is really important. And these two analyses that we will do, and some we have already done, coupled with this resolution, will, I think, pave the way of concrete implementation on the ground as much as possible, and this will certainly be our focus as ELC, and we of course look forward to working with the Council of Europe, different bodies that we are observers in and members of, in also taking this resolution even forward in other processes within the Council of Europe.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to open up to the floor. Is there any questions for the panelists? Yes.
Thank you for giving me the chance to speak. I'm going to speak in French. Bonjour, mon nom est Olivia Conrad.
Olivier Conrad. I'm working on a joint project, Olympus, for equality of rights and people in the world of sport. My first question will be for Marie Patouillet. Thank you so much for having taken the floor. It's great that athletes, that you actually give a voice to those who have been subject to discrimination, to violence, irrespective of the nature of this. Now, I would like to think about the relationship that you yourself have with media. You know, the media who are involved for us, for example, in France. We have a project with France. We have Nelson Montfort, who's, you know, a very well-known journalist. And we can see when we speak to people like him, we see there's a lot of work still to be done, the way that they talk about female athletes. So what is your approach? What is your personal approach? And do you have the idea that maybe journalists could maybe, dare I say, be allies in this cause? Thank you so much for your question. Now, as far as media are concerned, I made the strategic choice. Upstream, in other words, before the Games, I decided to work with a press attaché who was not from the sporting world and indeed came from the fashion world. And I thought, well, it was clear that sports journalists and journalism haven't yet deconstructed what they come with. You know, here I am, I'm a heterosexual and I only have heterosexual norms in my head. And it's difficult for them to deal with having to change their way of questioning. So the questions that they posed were very stereotypical in the past. So I decided, no, I'm going to choose who I work with. I'm going to choose who I communicate with. Of course, I wanted someone to come with me, to be accompanied, so to speak. So, of course, I was lucky to have a press attaché because, you know for sure that in the Olympic world we're not professionals, so we don't have the same funds that maybe others would have. So I think it's really important to think about the role of women in the space that is taken by women and lesbians in the world of sport. And then you can think about all other types of discrimination, whether it's racism or linked to religion within sport. So, but I made the choice to not work with the media that people thought that I would work with, but I didn't say yes to everybody. Of course, the day of the competition, you've got to answer the questions. But I managed to protect myself, and at least in the run-up to the Olympics, I was able to choose the messages that I wanted to put out there. I chose. Thank you very much.
Si je pourrais m'adresser. If I could also ask Marie Patouillet a question. I am the mother of a child who has an amputated leg, and he lost his leg at the age of 4. And I can say that I know how important sport has been in her rehabilitation, for his rehabilitation, not merely in physical terms, but psychological terms. So I think that perhaps sport is perhaps the most efficient means to overcome this. And of course, there's the public that is behind you, and that is also important. So we were delighted to see what you say. Positive messages, things were better in Paris than in Tokyo, so that's great to hear. However, I would now like to draw the attention of the public that we've created an alliance. It's a parliamentary alliance for good governance and integrity in sport, and this is following a conference that we organised at the beginning of November in Athens. And inclusivity, whether it be because of handicap or intersectionality, whether it's gender or sexual orientation, irrespective of this origin, it was mentioned in the alliance. We don't know to what end this will be
really efficient, but we thought it was a way of getting parliamentarians involved.
The civil society actors, and in particular Dragan and Anastasia, in Beatrice's report, the first recommendation we see is the adoption of strategies, of national strategies, in cooperation with associations, with organizations representing LGBTI persons. And we also speak about the need for training for police officers and training for health professionals. Now, to what extent you have experienced that? Have you been associated in designing national strategies? And what are your views about this very specific aspect of training, if I may?
Okay, I can start. In some of the member states of the Council of Europe, some of our member organizations that focus on LBQ issues have been already involved or consulted in the design of the action plans and strategies. However, the outcome has not been favorable for us. So they were consulted, but their contributions were not taken into account. This has also been an experience of ELC as us, as an international umbrella organization that works on the European and international level, that also we sometimes get invited to contribute, but we are not taken seriously, or this intersection is not taken as a priority. So I think this resolution will help in that, because there's something already there to provide the rationale and the guidance and the recommendation for national authorities. Given that it's coming from the Council of Europe, it has a special weight. And maybe just to say something that I think is interesting, how this resolution is already coming to life. Has been published not too long ago, but one of our member organizations from Serbia, actually, Labris, a lesbian organization, was reading it, and there's one recommendation that says that the parliaments are encouraged to celebrate the Lesbian Visibility Day. And since they were planning their own conference and event for next year in April, and they were searching for the venue and partners, and they said, okay, why don't we try? And they wrote to the Parliament of Serbia and said, listen, there's this resolution, it says in the recommendations that you should celebrate this day, why don't we do it together? And they were like, okay, let's do it. Even though previously they were rejected for not this specific event, but for some other suggestions for joint events. So it's happening already, and I think this is a good sign, and I hope we will have more positive examples for concrete implementation in the future. We will certainly be focused on that. And maybe I will use this opportunity to say one more thing, that I think that this resolution is not only important for Europe. Of course, Europe is the main focus, but also globally as a best practice example of something that can happen also in other world regions. And ELC is involved in the Global Lesbian Coalition, which is a coalition of 5 lesbian networks from different world regions, and together we bring over 3,000 lesbian organizations under one roof. And when we presented this resolution to our partners in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, they're already taking this document and trying to explore if a similar process can take place on the level of their own intergovernmental regional institutions in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So this is also, I think, very inspiring for the global lesbian movement and also for other intergovernmental institutions.
Thank you so much. I'll go to Lady Phil for a question.
So just very quickly, I think that brilliant panel, and thank you so much for everything you've said. ELC, I really want to commend you also from a civil society perspective, and having also done some work with you and been at your conference. There's a theme that runs through, and I'd like to know, what do you need by way of resource funding in order to progress LBQ rights? And this is not about being conservative, I think it's about being open. And just in terms of, I want to make sure I get, Marie and Anastasia in particular, what are you putting in place to look at well-being and that rest, resilience that's needed in order to keep on doing the work that you do?
I can start. Or do you want to? Okay.
Toujours en français.
Still in French. I've put an end to my sporting career as an elite athlete. I'm 36 and my body says no more. But I will continue to, go on this path, continue, fight phobia, fight sexism in sport. It's true that I often take the floor in French establishments when there are meetings. I talk about the necessity for well-being of athletes, because very often these people are young. I may be an exception, but it's true that when one is a teenager, it's not always easy to analyse who we are, what our feelings are. And again, we need to be accompanied. We need somebody. We need to have education programmes. Of course, there's education for those who work with athletes, but education, in other words, teaching more than... so that what they are able to then say, what is discrimination? So they should be able to be trained, that's okay, that's not okay. Because sometimes I can see that young athletes don't realise, I've just been discriminated against. Someone has just been violent against me. And sometimes it's 3 or 4 months later because they're talking to somebody. They go, oh no, that's what happened to me. Oh God, that's what happened to me 4 months at that match. What I went through was not okay, what I went through in the dressing rooms. But then 4 months, you can't fill out the form. Because we have that system after a match or something. When something happens, the person who could have filled out that form has already gone back to their federation. So for me, it is of the utmost importance that we put in place a programme to raise awareness for young people. You're coming into this world and the world is like that today. This is what you may be faced with and you need to be aware of this. But you also need to know this for yourself, because that's what makes who we are. These become our norms, and it's as we grow old, as we grow up, that we realise that that wasn't really us and that we would have liked to have known it before. Too many athletes, too many people in the sporting world have spent 30 years. They had really undergone traumatism after traumatism, but they only talk about it at the end of their sporting career, and then it's too late and they have to live with this trauma. So for me, there has to be a massive effort to have these teaching programs, not the staff that work with the athletes. It's a bit it started a bit, but it's going to be a long haul. But we really, really need to raise awareness about this so that they can be aware of what they may have to face.
And on the funding question, and thank you so much for raising this question, and you also addressed this also in your speech, and thank you so much for that. So as everything else in this world, access to funding is also gendered. And we as LBQ women's organizations have experienced it, have had so many obstacles and challenges in accessing funding over the years. And there's also data that shows it, that the LBQ women's movement is the least resourced movement within the LGBTI movements. And the percent that the newest report shows is that only 2% of globally available LGBTIQ funding is going to LBQ women's organizations. It used to be 8%, then 3%, then 5%, and now it's at the record minimum of all times, especially for Europe and Central Asia, which of course means that lesbian organizations, LBQ women's organizations are working with almost no funding at all on voluntary basis. Our own ELC's research shows that on average our member organizations are operating with between 1,000 to 5,000 euros annually. What can you do with that? Almost nothing. So a lot of our member organizations are relying on voluntary work, and given that there's so much work to be done, as we talked about today, in addressing, combating, and preventing violence and discrimination towards our communities, more resources need to be allocated for LBQ women's organizations, especially grassroots organizations. So just to answer your question, the situation right now is terrible. Given the geopolitical developments and also the developments in the funding sphere in general, we expect that the situation will only get worse, and that again LBQ women and LBQ women's organizations will be deprioritized in this overall global scarcity of funds. So we together, I think, as a movement and as stakeholders, need to find other ways and recognize that this is a huge problem.
I actually totally agree with Dragana, because when you have some funding, you understand that this is a long chain between these 2 points. So a lot of members who take money, and then like you pass some honey, yeah, you know, and then group organization have nothing but did all the work, So except doing all work, we need to train themselves for, I don't know, how to write report, good report, I don't know, perfect report, and don't take mistakes. And when we did it, we have a big, I don't know, conversation, partnership meeting, when we discuss why we had this mistake and what happened, and then you should, I don't know, go to 10 plus trainings and so on, and when we should and how we should do our work, when we all the time on the trainings and the meetings with donors and conversations with them. It's really strange. And actually we all, no, for instance, I will say on our organization, we all have expertise, and this expertise is huge, but we sometimes like I think I don't know how to say so another question and another sentences. Sometimes when we have a conversation with donors, it's like we have not partnership relationship, partner relationships, like we work on them. It's not the same that declared before, because every relationship should based on trust, and when we agree we're partners, it should be in real.
Yeah, I really feel that. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're just rapidly running out of time. But yeah, I absolutely agree. I'm going to give the final word to Beatrice and Katerina. We've heard about kind of the difficult situation in civil society that we're in, but from an institutional perspective, could you leave us maybe on a short word of hope?
Oui, toujours en français du coup.
I'm sticking to French. I would like to thank the members of our panel, because they've really shed light on this, and I've even taken notes, because, you know, we've written the report, but the role of the platform now comes into its own and helps parliaments and aims to help parliamentarians to implement what I've mentioned before. So thank you, Bella, for having moderated. Is that the right word? Moderated, and you've done so with great aplomb. Thank you so much, Lady Faye. I think you've understood, all of you, that there's still much work to be done, and I'm sure we're going to have the help of our Secretary General in this task. Seth.
Quickly, how, especially following up what Dragana said, how we could find resources. I'm sure with Evgenia we will manage to translate this resolution into the 46, well, we don't have 46 languages, we have some few, but in languages enough for this to be in the national language in all member states of the Council of Europe. Ideally, observers are panelists. Let's not forget, Israel Knesset has observer status with us. We have Jordan, Palestine, Morocco, and Kyrgyzstan as partners for democracy. So this allows us also to extend to the south of the Mediterranean. And I think this could be also a very good visibility tool, because in many member states, sometimes our texts are difficult to be, people don't have necessarily access because not everywhere English and French are spoken as we think. So this is a practical idea that just came out, and I'm sure we'll manage to get through. Thank you really for this discussion, and many, many thanks to those who are really committed on a daily basis to make our text a reality. Thank you.
A final word, Katerina, and then we will wrap the panel up.
You.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to say that at the Gender Equality Commission, in line also with the Reykjavik Declaration, we are moving towards a closer engagement with civil society, also with the youth dimension of the work of the organisation. So we hope that some of the intergovernmental and multilateral work is better informed and better guided by this engagement that we have also with ELC. And I very much look forward to the work that you mentioned, Dragana, about evaluating national gender equality strategies and national action plans against the resolution, because it'll be a great way to pinpoint where the weaknesses are, and but on a positive note, to show that there is guidance, there is know-how out there that needs to be properly listened to, and so I think that yes, the member states, there is a mixture of sometimes a lack of will, but there's also a lack of knowledge of how to go about serving these very underrepresented and traditionally underserved community. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much to the panelists, and I will hand back to Penelope. I know we're a little over time. My apologies. I did my best.
Yes, no, you did brilliantly. Thank you very much. I'm sure we all agree. Thank you, Bella, and thank you to the panelists. This is just to say that the interpreters have agreed to go over time a little bit now, but that means they need to have a break, as we do, I suppose, to do a little bit of networking, stuff that you can't do in the room, and accessoirement have a coffee. So I would ask you to be back in the room at 11:40 so that we can have a good session, a second session. Thanks so much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Hope you had a good networking coffee break. And we are just about ready to begin our second session of today with a new panel. Thanks for being here as well. Thank you for your contribution to this very successful so far day. Something I didn't mention this morning, the session is being live streamed on YouTube and recorded, and so we will use it, and you'll be able to use it as well in the future, so that it stays with us for a little bit longer, and also we will use it as parliamentarians for our future work in the Committee on Equality and Non-Discrimination. So, thank you very much. Now I will hand over the floor to our moderator for this session, Irene Zélinger? Irena. Okay, all right. Thank you very much, and here we go.
Well, good to see you again. I'm honored to facilitate this panel on intersectionality and violence on behalf of Women Against Violence Europe, which is a European network of feminist organizations combating violence against women. And I have to be humble here because for us, violence against LBQ women is a rather recent issue, and we cannot pretend to have all the answers and probably not even to have all the questions yet, but we are very willing to build alliances, and not only because we have to stand together now that we have this more or less general shift and ongoing shift towards the right and far right, towards authoritarianism and anti-gender and anti-woke ideology. So I wonder sometimes, being an LBQ woman myself, combating violence against women in a feminist organization, why it seems that we often have to choose to either be feminists but not that active on our LBQ part of our identities and needs and energy, genius, or we are active in the LGBTQI movement, but then we cannot be that much feminist anymore. And I think LBQ women really can play a crucial role in this alliance building between the feminist movement and the LGBTQIA+ movement, because we have kind of a leg in each of those, in each of them, and we bring this perspective that they are sadly still lacking too often. So that said, I'm relieved to not be on my own up here to talk about intersectionality and violence, but to be in the company of an impressive selection of experts who come to this issue from different directions, as activists, as researchers, as policymakers, and also as people who check the implementation of those policies. And with this rich combination of perspectives and experiences, I think we have a good chance to be able to move the conversation even more towards a life free from violence and discrimination and the full respect of fundamental human rights for LGBT women. And I'm organizing myself a little bit different than my predecessor. I will present my panelists individually and give them immediately a question to talk, so there's a little bit of suspense. Who are those people who will talk to you? And at the end, of course, there will be time for and space for your questions. So we'll start with Françoise Kempf. There she is. We have moved. Who works at the Violence Against Women Division of the Council of Europe, which, among others, follows up on the implementation of the Istanbul Convention Istanbul Convention is the combination of words that we always use at WAVE. So I'm happy to sit on the same panel with Françoise. She has a decade-long experience on human rights issues, amongst others also the rights of national minorities, Roma and travelers. And my starting question to you is, how does the Istanbul Convention assure that all women, including LBQ women, are equally protected against violence, and what does the track record so far say about intersectionality in the state parties' implementation efforts?
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much, Irene. I will switch to French now. Sorry. If you don't mind.
So thank you very much for inviting me today. Good morning to everyone. And as everyone who's spoken before, I'd like to first congratulate you for the drafting of this important report and resolution. So I'm here to talk to you about the prevention and fight against violence and discriminations against women from the point of view of the Istanbul Convention. I want to highlight the Grevio reports, the group of experts on the fight against violences against women and domestic violence. Thank you very much. Which is the group in charge of monitoring the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. So the issue of intersectionality is at the very heart of the Istanbul Convention. So as a reminder, there is a key part of the recommendation, which is Article 4.3, which tells the member states to implement the recommendation without any discrimination on sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and many other grounds for discrimination. As I said, the intersectional approach is at the heart of the implementation of the Istanbul Convention, and the Grevio in its monitoring work is paying attention to whether the Convention is applied for all women victims of violence. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to go through the different provisions of this Convention and evaluate, assess how the intersectional approach can be applied to them. First, it's about seeing whether strategies or national plans for the prevention and fight against violence against women do include or not an intersectional approach, and whether they take into account the increased risks of violence to which women exposed to intersectional discrimination are exposed, and whether there are specific obstacles that they may meet in their quest for support and protection. So in the majority of its evaluation reports published until now, the Grevio has highlighted, unfortunately, that it is generally problematic and that there's a lack of taking into account the situation of women facing multiple discriminations in national strategies, and therefore they regretted that the response given to these women when they're victims of violence is not effective. Grevio also highlighted two things. First, the need to include the fight against women in sectoral strategies targeting certain parts of the population, for example, disabled people, LGBTI people, migrant people, travelers, etc. And Grevio insisted on the fact that it is also necessary to include these populations and these groups of women in the global strategies in the fight against violence against women generally. So the idea is to have a double focus on specific populations, and at the same time not to lose sight of the fact that violence against women is a common experience of these groups and is a systemic issue. Grevio also highlighted that this intersectional approach needed to be applied to data collection. We know that in order to have effective policies and strategies, they need to be based on factual data. And quite often, Grevio has been able to note that there is a crucial lack of studies, quantitative and qualitative data on violence against women who face intersectional discriminations, including LBQ women. Another essential issue that's been highlighted several times by Grevio is the fact that civil society organizations, we've talked about them earlier this morning, CSOs that represent these women who face intersectional discriminations need to be involved, at least in the discussions leading to the design, implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of policies fighting against violence against women. That's a crucial part, and to that we need to add the issue of financing and funding of these organizations which represent women facing intersectional discriminations. We've talked about this morning. What Grevio has been able to witness or to realize is that everybody is looking for funding, but grassroots organizations who help these women facing discrimination are usually organizations that have the least access to funding. Usually they're small organizations, they operate on the ground, and so and there's a whole list of factors that limit their access to resources. Moving now to prevention, one of the four main pillars of the Istanbul Convention. For prevention, Grevio noted many gaps in the intersectional approach, for example, in education, general education and awareness raising with the population, which is not sensitized to the increased risks of violence faced by women in facing intersectional discrimination. And of course, then the other issue important with prevention is the lack of training of professionals who are in direct contact with victims about these increased risks and about the obstacles that are in the way of women who are looking for help. One issue that was highlighted from several countries is the fact that professionals, when they're trained, have a conception or a vision of intersectionality which tends to only target one factor of discrimination rather than actually looking at the intersection between the many factors of discrimination when they're dealing with a patient or a person who comes to them. And so, of course, the response, the support that's given to this person is actually insufficient, given that not all their issues are taken into account. The Convention highlights the need to have a non-discriminatory approach in the protection measures for victims of violence, and this is one of the areas where Grevio has noted that there was the biggest number of obstacles for women, including LGBTI women. Amongst the obstacles that were noted by Grevio, there are issues in terms of access to specialized services, such as shelters for women victims of violence, counsel and support services, or hotlines for victims. There are a series of obstacles preventing these women from accessing specialized services, especially health services. We do know already that these services don't always have the necessary resources or capacities to answer the specific needs of women facing intersectional discriminations, and quite often there's also the issue of training and awareness raising amongst their staff. Now, in the judicial sphere, similar issues arise, especially when filing complaints. Grevio has always criticized the training of law enforcement on intersectional discriminations and the fact that, as a consequence, women who are victims of violence are not received and helped the way they should be. And it just makes them hard for them to just even notify authorities of of the violences they're victim of. Since last year, Grevio has started a new thematic evaluation cycle. So now they're not looking at all the provisions of the convention when assessing a member state, but they focus on 19 provisions. The theme of this evaluation cycle is trust that women can have in the system, women victims of violence. the issue of trust is, of course, even more important for women who face intersectional discrimination, for whom trust in the system is even harder to establish, given the many obstacles they face and the compounding effects of discriminations we've talked about already. So in its new thematic evaluations, Grevio keeps paying particular attention to prevention and fight against violence against women who face intersectional discriminations. And in the first reports, 5 or 6 so far, that have been published by Grevio in this new cycle, they have noted that progress has been made in the implementation of the convention in the past 10 years in different areas. The response to violences committed against women who are exposed to intersectional violence, which includes LBQ women, is still quite lacking, and there are still many blind spots or gaps in the policies for the fight against violence against women. Now, I thank you for your attention. I already apologize because, unfortunately, I will not be able to stay with you until the very end of this panel. But thank you very much for listening to me.
And we will see in a couple of months how that will play out for the second evaluation of Belgium by Grevio, where I'm involved from the NGO side, and I insist on intersectionality in our alternative report. So I would like to give the floor now to 3 speakers who have specific experiences with the challenges of protecting LBQ women against violence and discrimination. First of all, I'd like to give the floor to Lucia Plavakova, who is a Slovakian member of parliament and also a member of the Parliamentary Platform for the Rights of LGBTI people in Europe. And as a lawyer, activist, and politician, she has addressed intersectionality issues throughout her career, among others through research, pro bono, legal counseling, and the founding of an NGO for rainbow families. So, Lucia, how can we defend the rights of lesbians, bi, and queer women, and how can we protect human rights defenders like you?
Thank you very much. I am really very happy to be here at this important conference. I will briefly start with describing the situation in Slovakia. I think many of you might be aware of the situation, but it is important for me to say my experience. And the situation in Slovakia is for a long time not good for queer people. We do not have any legal framework for same-sex couples. We don't have any legal protection of rainbow families. Transgender women are being forced to sterilizations, and the society is really full of homophobic rhetorics and is very much polarized. 2 years ago, 2 queer people, Matúš Horváth and Juraj Bankulič, have been killed in front of a gay bar at Zámodská Street in Bratislava. And during this terrorist attack, also a queer woman, Radka Trokšiarová, has been severely injured. One would think that this horrific act, would lead to a positive change in our society in Slovakia, but unfortunately, the opposite is reality. In Slovakia, we are now facing a populist, nationalist government with far-right tendencies, and one of the coalition parties expressly focuses on attacking queer people, is the Slovak National Party. They have already proposed several legislations attacking queer people. For instance, they want to ban the rainbow flag, and they want to ban any information on LGBTI people in schools. So far, they have not been successful, but they're still bringing these topics on the table and to the parliament, and I'm afraid that one day they might be successful also, and the laws might be passed. The verbal homophobic attacks come directly from several members of the government, including Prime Minister Robert Fico, and the most infamous for her statements is our Minister of Culture, Martina Šimkovičová, one example for all, she said that Europe is dying out because of the excessive number of LGBTI. So she's practically blaming queer people for the demographic crisis in Europe and for low fertility in Europe. This is, of course, a horrific statement which cannot be accepted in any society. Our Minister of Culture also stopped all the funding to NGOs focusing on projects which includes LGBTI people. And despite the fact that they met all the criteria and their projects have been accepted, but she changed the decision. And now her party, the Slovak National Party, has started a campaign placing billboards all around Slovakia stating, "We have stopped financing LGBTI projects." That's all around Slovakia. And in this atmosphere, I'm the only openly queer woman in our parliament, actually in its entire history. And so I have to face prejudice and homophobic and vulgar attacks on a daily basis. And it also resulted in a situation where I have been expelled from the session of the parliament because I had rainbow sticker on my notebook. And this was also accompanied by the vice president of our parliament saying homophobic statements at my address. And it was also followed by a press conference where one of the coalition MPs said one of the most vulgar swear words to my address. And he also stated that he does not consider me to be a woman. This also caused a public outrage, and I have been given a lot of support from the opposition politicians and many public figures. But however, it also led to death threats to me and to my daughter by supporters of this MP. So this is basically the situation in Slovakia, and really these homophobic attacks, as they come from the highest representatives of Slovakia, it is, of course, causing the spread of the homophobic statements and hate speech in the whole society. And even before these recent attacks in the parliament, I was dealing with the homophobic online attacks on a daily basis for years. And they, of course, frequently question my female identity, asking me vulgar questions, what I have between my legs. They also attack my family, stating that my family is not a family. And I'm also being repeatedly asked where I have my child from. And of course, I'm also getting a lot of sexual messages proclaiming that I need a real man and that I have to be raped to get normal. And I think I'm experiencing something which is like usual repertoire of homophobic rhetoric addressed at queer women. And it's not happening in Slovakia, it's happening everywhere in the world. This is only the example, the tip of an iceberg, I would say, because I can speak about it in public spaces. And let us face it, I think that the situation is getting worse. And the question is, what are we able to do about it? And I think I'm now in the best place to try to find these answers. And coming back to your questions, I think our Commissioner for Human Rights summarized it very well, the points which have to be done. But the situation, when I see the situation in Slovakia, we are going directly in the opposite way. So I think it is really important that also from the institutions, European institutions like Council of Europe, there is its attempt to shed a light on the situation in Slovakia, to speak about it publicly, but also try to use all the diplomatic tools to bring this issue on the table in every conversation where is it possible, and also try to find ways how to help the NGOs in in countries like mine, because really, if also the public funds are stopped, they are not able to support and to promote the LGBTI rights and to help LGBTI people in a way that it has to be. So we have to find ways how to help them as well. And I think it's not about, it's not only about the situation in, for instance, in Slovakia, and to stop this negative direction is not only because we need to help people in Slovakia, but we have to do it also as a preventive measure. So it's not copied in other countries, because this is something which is, I think, really on the table, and we have to be really careful, and we have to work on it, that it's not copied in other countries, because that is something which is worrying me really much. So this is not a very happy message from the Slovakia, but that's the reality, and I needed to say it in this room and in this platform, and to talk about it with you. And I'm very happy that this room is full of people who are really keen to bring some change to not only countries like mine, but to all the countries where LGBTI people live, and that is all the countries in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia, for sharing quite personal experiences. Next on my list is Kate Osborne, who is also a member of the Parliamentary Platform and a national MP for a progressive party, but this time for the United Kingdom. And she has also decades of experience as a trade union representative at the post office. And I'd like to ask you, Kate, can you tell us more about what you found works in combating violence against LBQ women? And in particular, how can we bring the Istanbul Convention and the new resolution to the work floor?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much. First of all, can I say solidarity to you, Lucia? It's far too common, the abuse that we face, and we must support each other and stand together against it. I spoke in the debate on Beatrice's report at the last Council of Europe session, and it was brilliant to have that report in the main chamber in the hemisphere for member states to take back to their countries. Yet even in that debate, we heard discriminatory comments around the need to focus on children's safety and not keep talking about these LGBT issues. In my contribution, I highlighted the need for us to take an intersectional approach when discussing violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. 40 years ago, I came out as a lesbian, and now as a member of the UK Parliament with 60 LGBT members of Parliament just on the Labour Party benches alone, I still face lesbophobia. On my way here on the Eurostar, I was misgendered 3 times in the space of 90 minutes by 3 different staff members. So we need to remember that gender-based violence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by the society that we live in. In every aspect of life, there are attempts to other people, and we've seen an increase in attacks on LBQ women. Strategies to tackle gender-based violence often exclude LBQ women, and even when they are included, they rarely mention the differences from within the LBQ community. With experiences of lesbian women and bisexual women being distinct, the experiences of LBQ women with disabilities, young LBQ women, black LBQ women, older LBQ women and trans women, all varied and diverse and rarely addressed. As with all gender-based violence, when targeted against LBQ women, it stems from a social construct where us others should be hidden and on the margins. And gender-based violence is a product of a system of dominance, of patriarchy, of class, and it is used to divide and rule. As a disabled lesbian woman, I face discrimination on all these characteristics, but I do not face racism or transphobia. So we must understand our differences and show solidarity with each other whilst refusing to let our community be divided. There's no hierarchy of discrimination, but there is a multifaceted impact for those who suffer a combination of discriminations. We cannot understand the scale of gender-based violence without looking at the different impacts and consequences on different groups of people, including from the LBQ community. We must also look at all the different ways that gender-based violence permeates through society, from physical and sexual abuse to emotional abuse to economic violence, and of course how women bear the brunt of the world's ills, especially during times of war. And I'll touch on things from a UK perspective and try to highlight some key concerns. Now, last year we held a debate in the UK Parliament on Lesbian Visibility Day. Following that debate, I faced some awful homophobic remarks. I was called a nonce, had serious threats, was attacked by anti-gender movements, and I had a poster campaign of lesbophobic hate against me in the constituency that I represent. But this is the tip of the iceberg, and as a politician with a platform, I can speak out about it. But too many women do not get the opportunity to speak out. When a global pandemic hit us, it was women who faced the brunt of the impact. For young girls still in education, they faced an increase in caring responsibilities, additional risks around sexual and physical violence within the home, and young LGBTQ+I people were isolated, and it had a huge toll on their emotional well-being and delayed their coming out. Lady Phil mentioned this morning the impact on austerity on women in the UK, and she's absolutely right. The limited safeguards that were there for LBQ women have been erased. Women's services all over have been cut until they're virtually non-existent. Services that focus on support for LBQ women, black women or migrants were the first to be shut down. For older LBQ women, they are more likely to feel isolated and alone. And older LBQ women face discrimination and abuse within social care, particularly settings like care homes, both in the care they receive and because they, in some cases, are still separated from their partners because their relationships are not recognised. I'm pleased the report touches on barriers to healthcare for LBQ women. In the UK, we have a gender health gap, and of course, for LBQ women, the gap is even larger, and for black women, the gap is even larger. Black women are more likely to suffer pain bias, and shockingly, black women are 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth than their white counterparts. LBQ women are less likely to seek medical help, likely to hide their sexuality from healthcare providers, and for migrant, black, trans, LBQ women, they distrust healthcare systems even more. LBQ women are forced to go through intrusive, unnecessary tests to prove that they need IVF. Even though there are no fertility issues, quite obviously, most LBQ women just need the sperm. Even after they've jumped those hurdles, they have to pay tens of thousands of pounds for treatment, whilst heterosexual couples can access for free. And we know that LBQ women have children often later in life, yet support is not available after the age of 35, as at that point we're referred to as being geriatric. I know. Discrimination and gender-based violence continues in almost every aspect of life and every industry, and in every case that discrimination is more pronounced when intersectionality comes into play. When I sat on the UK Parliament Women and Equalities Select Committee, we heard from women in the music industry who detailed their experience of gender discrimination, the constant belittling, objectification and sexual harassment. And we heard black women are the most disadvantaged in the music industry, experiencing over-sexualisation and sexual harassment, and disabled women were more likely to be subject to bullying and harassment. LBQ women were more likely to be told that they were not booked or given space as they were not sexually available or propositioned for sex. And we've seen LBQ women in the music industry finally get the credit that they are due in recent years. Yet black queer women like Bessie Smith had a huge impact on music over the years, as did Janis Joplin and many others. Yet they were sidelined and not spoken about in the mainstream. Music labels admitted to us in our inquiry, even now, that they don't want to take risks on LBQ women. We heard from female footballers who face sexism and inequality and gender-based violence for daring to play football. Women footballers attacked by people for being LBQ, regardless of if they identified that way. We heard that gender-based violence for girls in schools is increasing, ranging from how abuse moves from online to offline to an increase in coercive behaviours and LGBTQ plus homophobic abuse, as well as physical abuse in schools. And this has been made worse with school guidance from the last government seeking to prevent schools discussing gender identity issues, and with instructions that teachers were to disclose any student who was questioning their gender and inform their parents. In a similar way to, as Michael said this morning, why would you report homophobia to homophobes? Why would you seek support around your gender identity from a teacher if you think it will be used against you and you would be outed? I'm pleased that there's been mention of the anti-gender movements. I'm often attacked by the anti-gender movements, and they are pouring resources into targeted attacks, media advertising and organising, and we must organise to counter these attacks and attempts to drive back on women's rights. We must not be distracted by the current fabricated conflict between trans women and lesbians, which only serves to divide and undermine the fight for equality within our communities. We can't pit one group against another and then hope to eliminate discrimination. That is why we must continue to have an intersectional approach and to use whatever platforms we have to give voices to those who are missing. I've been hosting panels in the UK Parliament with the speakers entirely from our trans community. We cannot call ourselves allies if we do not amplify voices of those who would otherwise go unheard. What we need across Europe is more evidence and acknowledgement of the overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination. And with this analysis, we will deepen our understanding of all gender-based violence and enable us to tackle the root causes. The report talks about how we create inclusive communities and how we combat hateful rhetoric. And this is key. We must amplify and platform voices that are otherwise invisible. Too often, problems of discrimination, harassment and misogyny are seen as women's issues, and we're expected to experience and overcome, analyse and discuss, avoid and understand misogyny so that men don't have to. Today, I think, has been a good step forward for us working together to highlight these issues. Now we must ensure that LBQ women are at the centre of policy making, that we have intersectional strategies, that we have space to act and advocate on our own behalf, and that gender-based violence is not a problem that is left for us women to solve and to deal with alone. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm kind of over here. Now I'd like to present you to Maud Royer. Maud Royer is the president of the French.
So we're going to
Trans and cisgender women fight together for women's rights and against transphobia. Maud has also published the report Le Lobby Transphobe, the transphobic lobby. And so my question to you is, how does what Françoise and Lucia and Kate have said up to now compare to your experience as a civil society organizer and specifically in the French context?
Thank you. I will be also speaking French in the next few minutes.
Thank you for having given me this occasion to take the floor. I mean, it's extremely rare to have the possibility to talk not only about violence and discrimination that trans people are subject to, but more precisely, the violence that trans lesbian women are subject to. And it's at this point I would like to say how this resolution is a pioneering text, groundbreaking, because of the way it tackles the violence that trans lesbian women are subject to. And this is a first on an international scale. Trans lesbian women are the targets of transphobian rhetoric, but in fact the roots of this is found in lesophobia, and in fact intersectionality is an extraordinary tool, and we should always have it in mind when we look at, for example, black women and what black women have been subject to. But one also have to be ensure that we're using this tool that brings together everything, that we forget each specificity of discrimination and of each intersection. And we have to ensure that all these discriminations that people have been subject to, irrespective of where they are in society, they can affect other discrimination, and that's where we see this transformation of transphobia to lesbophobia, and what that gives rise to, and all this sexism. And in fact, sometimes it's difficult to make the distinction between one and other. What is transphobia? What is lesbophobia? Lesbian women, and this is something that we've been able to see in France, and indeed was at the inset of our organisation. Lesbian women are the ones that are targeted by these new transphobian rhetorics, and that are around the world and have been around, I would say, for several decades now. And I would say we really saw them come into force, I would say, in 2021 in France. But what do? They target trans women, but even within this group of trans women, it's lesbian trans women who are targeted. And here we hear the argument that is in a sense an accusation that says that trans women are trying to infiltrate these lesbian cultural spaces, as if cisgender lesbian women could not be in a couple with trans lesbians, and as if lesbian women could not be part of this cisgender space for a long time. We've also been able to see in some European countries that people have tried to make a movement which is LGB, in particular in the UK, drop the T. Thankfully, they were not fruitful in giving rise to a real movement, because this is usually heterosexuals that are at the root of this. But nonetheless, they had some sort of media success, because this discourse where, for example, trans women cannot be lesbians, well, because lesbians wouldn't want trans lesbians in their community, that is something that did have traction, and in fact reflected certain prejudice of transphobia, lesbophobia rather, in the general public. And you can see that that did get some traction in the general public and in popular culture and in pornography, where we have this obsession with the sexual act itself, with genitality, and that really does go hand in hand with a very easy, how can I put it, fetishization of lesbian sexuality. And we hear that people spend a lot of time, what are the female genital organs that are belonging to these trans women, because we don't know. and see that there's this impossibility for certain people to imagine that there can be trans lesbians, and a fetishization of lesbians that is centered on sexuality in pornography. So what did this give rise to? Well, this discourse, this narrative gives rise to transphobia, but it also gives rise to lesbophobia. Now, why do I say that? Because lesbians are often seen as disproportionately transphobian, whereas in reality, this is not true, because the very few studies that we've had access to show that, on the contrary, when one studies the opinions of different social groups, when we look at sexual orientation, lesbians are by far the social group that is in fact the most open to the rights of trans people in society by a long shot. But from an institutional point of view, this gives rise to a way of conceiving things where they think they have to have this imaginary conflict between these two communities, which, you know, is in fact a minority, in fact even almost anecdotal. These transphobic narratives have been around for a few years. They go hand in hand sometimes with lesbophobia, and they reinforce this growing number of violence and we can see that there's great difficulty in having access to justice. And indeed, we talked about this earlier. For example, it's impossible sometimes for trans persons to be able to make an official complaint. And indeed, there's a report by Amnesty International that talks about the refusal to take on board these official complaints by trans women. And indeed, also as far as immigrant sexual workers are concerned, this is not something that only deals with trans women. There is very often this impossibility to make an official complaint. And it's also impossible for people to think that maybe that lesbians are sex workers, because the majority of their clients are men. But in fact, when you look at figures, you know, things are pretty different. Now, the few figures that we have actually make us think that for as far as trans women are concerned, a third or almost half would define themselves as lesbian or bisexual, which is of course well above the figures that we have for cisgender lesbians and for sex workers who are at times trans women. So indeed we have very few figures on this subject, but we nonetheless have institutional discrimination. For example, I've said impossibility or difficulty to have recourse to justice when you have been subject to violence. I think it's important to highlight this. We can also talk about other types of discrimination that are produced by the very institutions in other walks of, in other parts of life. For example, access to health, or indeed, for example, for trans people who still have their condition given a psychiatric dimension. In other words, it's not the person who decides whether they can embark upon transition or not. So they are not able to self-determine their life and have the free choice of what they want to do with their body. But no, it's still a doctor that will evaluate whether this person is really trans or not, and this will then allow them to have access to this transition medication or not. And in this particular situation, to be heterosexual, of course, generally corresponds much more to what psychiatrists are expecting. And you can see that lesbophobia is alive and kicking with all of these doctors who are really doing their utmost to put an end to this self-determination. We've also got, for example, another problem with, for example, the conservation of gametes, for example, or reproduction technology. And what of the last point, which is the legal recognition of gender? In fact, 18 countries still impose important medical acts, such as, for example, operation or sterilization. Others have the demand, the necessity for a medical certificate. So here you can see that lesbophobia is very much alive and kicking, because who is going to determine whether someone complies or not with what someone should be? So here again, of course, it's much easier to have a relationship with a man than with a woman when you want to be recognised as a woman. So if I may, in conclusion, I think then it would be important for me to say we have to take on board the following, that when one is trying to fight lesbophobia violence, this is also transphobia violence many times. And when one looks at the violence that trans lesbians are subject to, this is in fact only really lesbophobia that is experienced in specific instances, which is what trans women go through, that only trans women experience, but is expressed primarily through the lens of an expectation of a trans woman to be recognized as their own gender.
Very interesting and precise analysis. We'll turn to our researcher on the panel, Ruth Mestre of the University of Valencia in Spain. She has a background in law, philosophy and sociology, and brings a feminist and intersectional lens to her research. Of particular interest to us today are two reports she co-authored, one for the Council of Europe and one for ELC. The titles are, because I really want you to look them up if you don't know them yet, Ensuring the Non-Discriminatory Implementation of Measures Against Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, Article 4.3 of the Istanbul Convention, and, short but sweet, Lesbianizing the Istanbul Convention. So, which shortcomings and priorities has your research highlighted concerning violence against LBQ women?
Thank you, Irina. Well, thank you for this invitation. Thank you for the panel, for the recommendation. Like Irina was saying, I've been working mainly on how to introduce intersectionality in the Istanbul Convention. So what does it mean to introduce an intersectional lens to fighting gender-based violence? Because states need to pay attention to the fact, so introducing intersectionality means that states need to pay attention to the fact that women that are located at the intersection of different systems of power and discrimination may be in a more vulnerable position to suffer certain forms of violence, like we've been hearing this morning. That violence impacts different women differently, and that therefore the subsequent needs, so the needs that violence creates in women, are also different. Françoise, she just left, but she has explained how Grevio addresses the issue, because both states and Grevio are trying to introduce this perspective and are trying to implement the Istanbul Convention without discrimination, and of the different strategies that can be developed, which we can talk about later if you want. I'm just going to focus, like Irina was saying, on one of them, which is mainstreaming diversity within the framework of gender-based violence structures, which is what we call lesbianizing the Istanbul Convention. So when I say lesbian, I mean LBQ women, and most of the times I just say lesbian, and we move fast. So the report actually has over 20 recommendations, and I'm not going to go through that. But I will just shortly present some of the priorities that we saw, and most of those priorities have already been mentioned by the different speakers in the room throughout the morning. The first priority is to do research. Lesbian experiences with gender-based violence are under-researched and therefore are unaddressed, because we need research and we need to improve data collection to plan a response, to adequately respond to gender-based violence. It has been also mentioned, I think it was Anastasia who said that lesbians have shown mistrust in state agents. They show fear of being targeted as queer and being re-victimized by those agencies. So They are usually not in official statistics. They're usually not, the surveys do not include their perspectives either, and it is NGOs who usually have access to that information and who usually can collect data that is relevant for knowing the type of violence lesbians confront. So we need, because research and knowledge are needed to design the policy and to evaluate those policies, we need a coordinating body that includes lesbian organizations as on equal standing to plan, to gather data that is safe and that can be used, to design policy from the very beginning and not at the last moment, and to implement such policies and to evaluate them, because it is lesbian NGOs who will receive the complaints and will meet the needs of the community much better. So integrated policies must include lesbian experience, lesbian needs, and lesbian expertise from the very beginning. Like Lady Phil was saying this morning, that means rearranging the table. So yes, we need to rearrange the tables at state institutions. The third one, so there's already two, research and data collection, and integrating NGOs in the coordinating body. The third one has to do with training, because the shortcomings in data collection and in the involvement of NGOs in policy making, together with the lack of research, results in policy failures, and most of the times violence against lesbians is not perceived as violence at all. It's not perceived as being gender-based, or sometimes it is referred to, it is acknowledged, but then acknowledged in theory, in discourses, but then ignored in laws, in legislation, and in policies. So when women go to report, they confront re-victimization. So another priority is, it's been said also, professional training to prevent re-victimization, to prevent institutional violence that women encounter frequently, and to dismantling stereotypes. And this professional training should address lawyers, should address the judiciary. I come from that area, and there's a huge work to do. It should include social services, police, but also the staff working in specialized services and in general services. So the first priority, or this first strategy, would be to lesbianize the framework where, or the structure responding to gender-based violence in each state. And this is important, but we also found in research, also talking to lesbian organizations, that it is important to go beyond inclusive policies that just add lesbians to the frameworks and to the way things are done and addressed. So we try to answer to the question, what would lesbianizing those frameworks look like? So what would it be to lesbianize not just this structure, but also the substantive law that is contained in the Istanbul Convention? Because the fact that lesbian experience is not contained in the terms we use, in fact, one of the interviewed said that the semantic field of gender-based violence does not cover lesbian experience. So because the terms that we use do not reflect lesbian experience, there's a systemic pattern of failure, if you like, in the protection of them from gender-based violence. So to address that problem, and also the problem that I was saying, that professionals do not recognize gender-based violence against lesbians as gender-based violence at all. So to address that problem, we developed 2 strategies in our report for ELC, Professor Sara DeVito and I. And we moved between those 2 strategies. One is finding what we called a fitting solution within the Istanbul Convention, and the other one was to look for a new narrative. So very briefly, because, fitting solutions. So for us, fitting solutions encourage a lesbian interpretation of the IC, of the Istanbul Convention, so that the Istanbul Convention can be used to offer protection to lesbians by making the reality and experiences fit into the scope of the provision. So, for instance, in that way, what we do is to show the lesbian manifestation of a particular form of violence that the Istanbul Convention calls gender-based violence. So one of the things that we did was to make a table of correspondences where we had the form of violence and the article in the Istanbul Convention, the definition that the Convention gives, what are the conducts, and what is the lesbian manifestation of that, so that we can see that the different forms of violence that women confront, LBQ women confront, are gender-based violence and have that manifestation. So, for instance, I'd rather go there later. The other strategies, so one is showing this lesbian manifestation, and the other one was to analyze aggravating circumstances while we await for the incorporation of lesbophobia as such as an aggravating circumstance. So, in this showing the lesbian manifestation and the table of correspondences, we found, for instance, that we could incorporate conversion practices, especially when it is youngsters who suffer them, as psychological violence, which is covered by the Convention. And then we could add the aggravating circumstances to be done in the house to somebody that is in a particular position of vulnerability. So in that way, we can bring lesbophobia to the fore and also account for the specific violence young lesbians suffer in the house, for instance. The last strategy, and this is hard, I don't want to start a polemic on this, but funding new narratives calls the attention to the fact that we need to have far more discussions about what is the best approach, what is the best policy to protect lesbians from gender-based violence equally. So how can we queer up, if you like, the perspective from which we discuss and engage in policy design when it comes to gender-based violence? This, like I say, this entails engaging in difficult discussions, and they may also depend on the different context. And because this convention has to be enforced and implemented in the different states, is a discussion that may have to be done in the state fora. 2 examples. One of them was how should we address and how can we talk about and discuss and address domestic violence and intimate partner violence? What would be the best policy so that lesbians are equally protected and trans women are equally protected as cis straight women are? How should we address that? Knowing that legislation that is gender neutral is not the solution because it eliminates power, it eliminates gender, and then we throw the baby with the water. And another issue could be, for instance, given the presumption of heteronormativity of all spaces, should we work for special services and safe spaces in different areas? Do we need special shelters, separate shelters, helplines, elders' houses, what kind of response is better for that. So these are just some ideas that to start discussing differently about how to draft a better public response, how to plan a better public response that takes into consideration the specific situation and needs of LBQ women that confront gender-based violence. And of course, it's been already in the room, funding is key for all the issues that I just mentioned. Thank you.
Here, here. Thank you, Ruth. There's a lot to take away with us from the strategies to think through and act on it. Thank you so much. Last but not least, we'll turn to Evgenia Giacomopoulou, who is the head of the SOGIESC Unit, which is the Committee of Experts on Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Expression, and Sex Characteristics, which is a whole mouthful. It is the unit of the Council of Europe that safeguards the human rights of LGBTI people. She has invested a lot of effort in bridging the gap between international organizations and civil society and grassroots organizations. So my questions to you are, can you tell us more about your experience with this kind of cooperation, and what would you like us to take home with us from this day, half day?
Thank you very much. I'm a terrible last-minute person, always with my notes, and today I've outdone myself, and I was so busy listening to everybody that I don't know. Bear with me, it might not come in the right order, but some thoughts, also because I don't want to add or repeat what was said, but more sort of like give you my takeaways from where also we sit in this organization. Before I do that, I want to thank and just I'm already starting with putting things in the wrong order. I want to start by thanking everybody and just flag that for this one event, when we thought who would we like to have at the table, we made a sort of dream list, a wish list, and the moment we reached out, everybody said yes. And that, aside from making me very happy, and I want to thank everybody for joining the conversation, it also makes me think that, you know, we were right to think that there was a need, an appetite, a starvation for a topic that was for way too long completely dismissed, undermined, not considered, interesting or important enough. And yet, I think I've heard so much rich contributions that will benefit not just LBQ women, but the LGBTI movement at large, women, and ultimately human rights, because we know how these topics are being at the center of broader attacks on human rights. So thank you very much for the quality and eloquence of everything that's been said so far. Well, our unit, also part of the Council of Europe, but as next to the Parliamentary Assembly, we are working at the intergovernmental level. So instead of working with parliamentarians, we work with the governments, and we try to help them get their policies together on the topic of LGBTI persons' rights, but we also work on cooperation. So we do these two things. We do policy making, so standard setting, and also cooperation. We support our member states in implementing those standards. So we come from these two angles. And since I've been in this position, I have to say, which is a bit over 2 years, a lot has happened on LBQ women, and I want to take stock, because before that there was nothing, really. I mean, it's just, it is a groundbreaking resolution, but even today's event is completely groundbreaking. I'll just give credit to the Icelandic presidency, because they were the very first ones to place the word lesbian in an event on a title like that, and it was during Lesbian Visibility Day during their presidency. And since then, we now have an instrument to work with. We have a high-level event. We are giving visibility. And I think these things matter enormously, because the championing, as was said earlier, really bears fruit. It matters. It gives ground for us to keep working. It anchors this in our work politically, but also then validates the need for supporting the movements and hopefully adapting the policies at national level, so that trust is built and implementation comes real. It's also very important that today is not just, so it's a step further. Lesbian Visibility Day, to talk about lesbians is a good thing, but to talk about LBQ women as part of the 16 days of activism is even more important, because it is the recognition of this buzzword intersectionality that we are LGBTI issues and LBQ women and the violence and discrimination they face is a form of gender-based violence, and that it breaks the silos with which our institutions tend to work, and to emphasize this continuum that there is in the violence, and to not yield, not follow this tendency that there might be, that it's easier if we just separate the topics, which at the end of the day only results in the most disadvantaged groups, the ones that tend to not seek out services because they don't trust them, who do not report violence they face, to be left out. So the groups that would ultimately need it the most are the ones that may drop out if we are not better at implementing it intersectionally. So again, I'm extremely pleased. I think today matters into all the things it means that it's happening as part of the 16 days of activism, and that we hear the voices of, I'm going to call them generic women's rights organizations, of our colleagues from the Gender Equality and the Grevio as well. In addition, of course, to all the, I haven't begun to thanking the civil society for their work and contributions. Perhaps a few comments on the fact that I'm really optimistic, and I'm really happy that it was said already earlier today that we can really, there is possible to translate these works and these resolutions that may seem distant and opaque to the outside world into the ground. And here we have a role to play, but our INGO partners have a big role to play into flagging them, into transferring them, into showing actors on the ground that these texts exist and that they are for them to seize. So we have already discussed ideas of how to even facilitate that. So already concrete takeaways even from these conversations today. I think this all is really also helpful in seeing the progress. We are working in a context where indeed, if you look back since the unit was created about 10 years ago, there's a lot of progress. There's promising practices. There's best practices that we keep collecting around. So we are advancing. But at the same time, we're doing this in a context of extreme backsliding on human rights and the instrumentalization of this topic. We heard as a really regrettably illustrative example from what's happening in Slovakia. And so we see how it affects at all levels. It affects civil society on the ground, where the spaces are shrinking, but also it results in silencing or attempting to silence public figures and lesbians and LBQ women from participating in the public sphere and in politics. So again, it's really amazing to see you keep going and that you stay at the table and that you occupy the space and that you're visible and that you're not being silenced. So yes, bridging the gap with the ground, we need to be better at that. And then in terms of what our unit will do, and I'll finish here, concretely on these topics. So we're very lucky at this intergovernmental structure to be able to work with a large array of INGO partners who are able to feed into our conversations, one of them being ELC. So that matters, also being observers in other committees to increase this transversality between our various topics and sectors. So one of the things that I think is particularly exciting that's coming up for us and which we started discussing yesterday is gender expression within this intergovernmental sphere. So how gender expression as a discrimination ground affects how it manifests and how then to develop policies around it. Of course, it affects, the interesting part is it affects everybody, because it affects everybody who deviates from expressing their gender in the normative expected way. But it will be especially relevant for LBQ women as being a group that is typically oppressed on the way they are perceived, be they really LBQ or not, by the way. Yeah. And so this is just a piece of work for you to be on the lookout for. And intersectionality, I'll just flag that, is a topic that is also not only within our committee, but in the broader anti-discrimination steering committee will be the topic of a recommendation. And we are standing our ground there on making sure it is not conflated with multiple barriers, because it is not the same thing. We heard examples today to give the most striking one, but such issues as corrective rape. There are differences between multiple barriers and intersectional violence. So we are going to continue being very present in those discussions. And of course, in cooperation, well, we are present in all our member states and working, and we have also some of our partners from the member states and from the INGOs in the room, because we work with them on a day-to-day basis and make sure that, you know, we create spaces for transformative strategies to assist the better preparation of shelters and services. So yes, we will continue to stay really close and work hand in hand, and hopefully have more positive developments to report on. Thank you so much. Sorry to the interpreters, I speak too fast, I know. But it's because I was out of time, sorry.
Yeah, when lunchtime is closing in, then we have all to talk faster. And that also means for the Q&A session that we can have one, max 2 questions before it's really, really over. And we can continue the conversation during the reception. So, are there any questions? After the food for thought, food for the body.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for the speakers in the 2 sessions. Thanks to the great moderators. Thank you to the audience. Thank you to the colleagues. Thank you to our parliamentarians who've made the journey and contributed to this really interesting and really substantial conference that we had today. I think from the beginning to the end, often we get opening or welcome speeches that do not have much content. Today, I think was the opposite. We had lots of things to think about from the start to the finish. So thanks to all of you. Now, yes, we've deserved some food and some drink, maybe. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you for the interpreters. Thank you.